A man with grease on his hands built what billion-dollar labs could not. A woman who had everything learned that the one thing money cannot buy is the will to fight. And the rarest kind of love is the kind that refuses to let you quit. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me until the very end, because this one is going to hit you somewhere deep. The garage smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee and something harder to name. That particular scent of a man who has been working past the point of exhaustion for so long that the exhaustion has become invisible to him, just another layer of skin he wears without thinking. Mason Reed locked the front bay doors at 11:47 on a Tuesday in November, the same way he locked them every night. Twice on the deadbolt, once on the padlock his grandfather had left him. Even though the lock was so old it barely functioned and anyone with a decent screwdriver could have gotten through in 30 seconds. He locked it anyway. Some habits were less about security and more about ritual, about telling yourself that one part of the day was finished and another was beginning. He stood in the cold for a moment, breath fogging in front of his face, and looked up at the sky above Flatbush Avenue. No stars. There were never stars over Brooklyn, just that dull orange-gray glow of 10 million lives pressing against the dark. A taxi honked somewhere on the avenue. A woman laughed from an apartment above the laundromat 2 doors down. The city never stopped making noise, and Mason had long since stopped hearing most of it. He went back inside through the side door. The front half of the garage was for the business. 2 lifts, a parts wall, a battered service desk with a computer so old it still ran Windows 8 without complaint. That was the Mason Reed that his customers knew. Reasonably priced, reliable, honest enough to tell you when something didn't need fixing. He'd built a decent reputation in 6 years. Nothing spectacular, decent. The back half of the garage was something else entirely. He moved through the curtain, literally a curtain, an old moving blanket he'd hung from the ceiling joist, and the air changed. Warmer back here because of the space heater he ran too close to the workbench, which he knew was a fire hazard and didn't care enough about to fix. The smell changed too, from oil and rubber to something sharper. Solder. Electronics. The synthetic smell of foam padding and polymer tubing. On the workbench, under a tangle of wiring and a half-eaten granola bar, sat the machine. He'd been calling it the machine for so long that giving it a real name felt premature, like naming a baby before you knew whether it would survive the first year. It looked, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, like the wreckage of several different industrial accidents. Aluminum struts cannibalized from an old scaffolding system. Servo motors he'd ordered one at a time from 3 different suppliers, paying with whatever was left after groceries and his daughter's school fees. A control unit built around a microcontroller board that a 22-year-old engineering student had sold him for $40 at a swap meet in Park Slope. It was a mess. It was also, if Mason was being honest with himself at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November, the most important thing he had ever done or would ever do. He pulled the stool up to the workbench, unwrapped the other half of the granola bar, and got to work. His daughter's name was Lily, and she was 7 years old, and she was currently asleep upstairs in the apartment above the garage with her nightlight shaped like a crescent moon throwing pale yellow light across her ceiling. Mason knew this because he'd checked on her before coming back down, standing in the doorway long enough to watch her chest rise and fall twice. It was a thing he did. He didn't know when it had started, this compulsive checking, this needing to see with his own eyes that she was still breathing. Probably around the time her mother had left, 4 years ago, when Lily was 3 and Mason was 28 and convinced, briefly, that his life had ended. It hadn't ended. It had just been reorganized around a new center of gravity. Lily woke up at 6:15 every morning and came downstairs and made herself cereal because Mason had taught her that independence was not optional. It was a skill, the most important skill he could give her. She packed her own school bag. She tied her own shoes. She was, by the standards of her second-grade class, unusually self-sufficient, which her teacher had mentioned twice in parent-teacher conferences in tones that Mason couldn't quite read as either compliment or concern. What her teacher didn't know was that Lily also knew how to identify a stripped bolt, that she could recite the names of 12 different wrench sizes in order, and that last spring she had helped Mason solder a connection on the control board of the machine, her small hand steadier than his for that particular operation, her tongue poking out between her teeth in concentration. "Is it for Aunt Claire?" she had asked after. Yeah, baby, Mason had said. It's for Aunt Claire. Claire Reed had been 26 when she died, 4 years before Lily was born, in a hospital bed at NYU Langone Medical Center from pneumonia that had developed into a complication that her compromised immune system could not survive. She had spent 11 years in a wheelchair, the result of a spinal injury from a fall she'd taken at 15, fooling around on a construction scaffold on a dare, the kind of thing that 15-year-olds do without any concept of consequence. She'd spent those 11 years with a remarkable ferocity of spirit that Mason had never been able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't known her. Claire Reed had been, in the language of people who say such things, a force of nature. What Mason remembered most, though, what he carried most, was not her ferocity. It was an afternoon in March, 3 months before she died, when he'd been sitting with her in her apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator, because there was always a broken elevator, and she had looked out the window at a woman jogging past on the sidewalk below, and the expression on her face had not been jealousy or bitterness or anything dramatic. It had just been tiredness, a deep, quiet, particular kind of tired. Mason, she had said, still watching the window, I would have liked to run, just once, even slow, even just down the block. He had not known what to say to that, he still didn't, but he had been building an answer for the better part of 3 years. The machine was, at its most basic, an exoskeleton, a wearable robotic framework that attached to a user's legs and torso and replicated the mechanical function of walking through a system of motorized joints and sensors that read the body's remaining electrical signals and translated them into movement. The concept was not new. Research labs at MIT and Stanford and half a dozen biotech companies had been working on powered exoskeletons for spinal injury rehabilitation for decades. There were commercial systems on the market, expensive ones, systems that cost more than Mason made in 5 years, that required specialized technicians to operate, that were available in a handful of rehabilitation centers scattered across the country. Mason's machine was different, and he knew it was different, though he'd spent a long time not trusting that knowledge because he was, by every external measure, not the kind of person who made medical breakthroughs. He was a mechanic in Brooklyn. He'd done 2 years at a community college before dropping out when Claire's medical expenses began to pile up. His engineering education was a combination of YouTube, library books, 2 online courses he'd completed between 2 and 4 in the morning over the span of 18 months, and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent his entire adult life understanding how mechanical systems moved and failed and could be fixed. What he'd figured out, and this was the thing, the small thing that he believed was actually new, was a problem with the sensors. The existing commercial systems worked by detecting voluntary muscle contractions, which meant they were only useful for patients who still had some residual neuromuscular function. For patients with complete spinal cord injuries, they were useless. Claire had been a complete injury. Lily's neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, who'd been in a wheelchair for 12 years after a car accident, was a complete injury. The majority of people who ended up paralyzed were complete injuries. What Mason had spent 3 years building was a system that didn't rely on muscle signals at all. Instead, it read microchanges in skin conductance, breath pattern, and weight distribution to anticipate and initiate movement, essentially teaching the machine to read the body's intent rather than its commands. He'd developed the algorithm by watching videos, hundreds of hours of videos, people walking, people standing, people shifting their weight before they knew they were going to take a step. He'd fed everything he learned into the control software, modifying it line by line, testing it with sensor arrays attached to his own legs, until the pattern recognition was good enough to pass his own tests. Whether it was good enough to work on an actual patient, he didn't know. He hadn't gotten that far yet. He worked until 2:15 in the morning, when his eyes started doing the thing where the soldering iron left trails in his vision. Then he ate the rest of the granola bar, turned off the space heater, and went upstairs to sleep. He checked on Lily one more time. Still breathing, still there. He set his alarm for 5:45 and lay down on top of the covers with his clothes on. In the morning, the machine would still be waiting. It had been waiting for 3 years. It could wait a few more hours. The Langford car came in on a Thursday. It was impossible to miss. a black Mercedes S-Class, current model year, with the kind of quiet that expensive cars have, that specific absence of road noise that communicates wealth more clearly than any badge. It pulled up in front of the bay doors at 11:20 in the morning, which was inconvenient because Mason had a Honda Civic on the lift with a brake caliper situation that needed his full attention, and he was not in the mood for new business. The man who got out of the Mercedes was somewhere in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing a coat that probably cost more than Mason's monthly rent. He had the posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime being right about things and expected to continue. "This the mechanic?" the man said, looking at the garage sign with an expression that suggested he was skeptical the sign was telling the truth. "That's what it says," Mason said. He wiped his hands on a rag that didn't do much and walked over. "What's the problem?" "It died. Completely. Dashboard lights, everything. I had it towed." Mason looked at the Mercedes. Then he looked at the man. "You got roadside through the dealer?" "I'd prefer not to wait. I'll pay for the convenience." Mason considered this. He looked back at the Civic on the lift. "Give me an hour on the other car, then I'll look at yours." The man looked like this wasn't the answer he was accustomed to getting, but he nodded. "Fine, I'll wait. There's coffee inside. It's not good. I'll manage." The man's name turned out to be Gerald Langford, which meant nothing to Mason until he heard it twice and placed it. Langford Capital, which he knew vaguely from news he half paid attention to. Real estate, financial services, some technology investments, old money that had learned to grow. Mason had no particular feelings about old money one way or another. Money was money and cars were cars. And this car had a dead alternator, which he identified in 40 minutes and confirmed in 5 more. "It's your alternator," Mason told him. "Battery's drained because it's been running on nothing. I can replace it today if you can get me the part. German cars, the dealer usually has them in stock, but they'll charge you twice what I will." Gerald Langford, to his credit, didn't argue about this. "Whatever you need to do," he said. He was on his phone, answering emails, having demonstrated within about 10 minutes that his tolerance for waiting was exactly as thin as his coat was expensive. "I'll need the car by 5. I'll need the part by 2. I'll have someone bring it."
아순시상?
Us son. While Gerald Langford made the calls and Mason went back to the Civic, the Mercedes sat in the forecourt, black and shining in the November sun, and it was while Mason was cleaning up after the Civic and walking back through the bay that he noticed the woman in the passenger seat. He almost didn't see her. The tinted windows were dark enough. But the rear passenger door was open slightly, and he caught movement, a hand adjusting something. A particular stillness in the way someone sits when sitting is not by choice but by necessity. He didn't stare. He went inside to write up the Civic invoice and start on the parts order. At 2:30, when the alternator had arrived and Mason was halfway through the replacement, he heard voices from the office, his one and only office, which was less of an office and more of a converted storage room with a desk and a space heater and a filing cabinet that had never once been successfully closed. Gerald Langford was on the phone, pacing, speaking in the clipped shorthand of men who bill by the hour. And in the chair by the window, the chair Mason kept there ostensibly for customers, though customers rarely sat in it, was the woman from the Mercedes. She was in a wheelchair, a good one, lightweight titanium frame, the kind that collapsed and folded with the mechanical efficiency of a well-engineered thing. She had dark hair pulled back, and she was wearing a charcoal coat over what looked like a very expensive sweater, and she was reading something on a tablet with the focused expression of someone who does not intend to acknowledge their surroundings. Mason got a glass of water from the cooler in the corner. He was about to go back to the bay. "Is the coffee actually bad?" the woman said, without looking up from her tablet. "Or were you just managing expectations?" Mason paused. "Both," he said. "It's from a gas station. I buy it in bulk." She looked up then. Brown eyes, sharp. The kind of face that was difficult to read in the way that some people are difficult to read. Not closed off exactly, but controlled. She had the look of someone who had spent a great deal of time deciding what to show. "At least you're honest about it," she said. "Not much point in lying about coffee." He got himself a cup too, since he was there, and took a sip. It tasted like it always did. Bad in a reliable way. "You're his daughter? Is it that obvious?" You have the same way of looking at a room like it's slightly disappointing, Mason said, and then immediately felt like that was probably too much. But she laughed. A short surprise sound, like it had gotten out before she decided to let it. That's accurate, she said. I'm Sophia. Mason. How long on the car? Another hour, maybe less. Alternator job isn't complicated, just fiddly on this model. She nodded and looked back at her tablet, but something in her posture had shifted slightly. Relaxed, maybe, or just recalibrated. Mason couldn't tell which. He went back to the bay. He finished the Mercedes at 4:15. Gerald Langford paid without discussion, which Mason always appreciated. Some people had money and treated paying for things as an imposition, like reality was being rude to them. Gerald wrote the check and shook Mason's hand and was on his phone before he was back in the driver's seat. Sophia Langford was the last one out. Mason had set the temporary ramp he kept for oil changes, a rubber threshold ramp, nothing fancy, at the gap between the forecourt and the sidewalk without thinking about it, without making a thing of it. She rolled through without comment, but at the edge of the forecourt, before the driver had come around to assist, she stopped. You built that? She said. Mason looked where she was looking. The moving blanket curtain was open. He usually kept it closed during business hours, but he'd been in and out all day and apparently had stopped noticing. Through the gap, the back bench was visible. The machine, in its half-assembled state, the wiring and the struts and the foam padding. He thought about saying it was nothing, a hobby project, something vague. Instead, he said, working on it. She looked at it for a moment longer. He couldn't read her expression. Then the driver had come around, and she was moving toward the car, and Mason pulled the curtain closed and went back inside. He didn't think about it again, or told himself he didn't. She came back the following Monday. No car trouble. She came in a different vehicle this time, a smaller SUV, with a driver who parked on the street and stayed there. She came through the side door and rolled into the waiting area, and when Mason looked up from the engine he was working on, she said, I'm not here about a car. I figured, he said. I want to see the machine. He set down the wrench. He looked at her for a moment. He hadn't told her it was an exoskeleton. He hadn't told her anything about it. She must have looked him up or looked at what she'd seen long enough to put something together. Why? He said. Because I haven't walked in 2 years, Sophia said. And I'd like to. The way she said it was not dramatic. That was the thing. It was just factual, delivered in the same even tone she might have used to state a quarterly figure. 2 years. I'd like to. As though she had thought about it so much that the emotion had been worn smooth, like a stone in a river. And what was left was just the bare, hard fact of it. Mason wiped his hands on the rag. It's not finished, he said. I can see that. It hasn't been tested on an actual person. I know. There are risks I can't. I'm aware of the risks, Sophia said, and for the first time something moved behind her eyes. Not anger, but something adjacent. I have been aware of approximately every available risk for 2 years. I have seen 7 specialists. I have been to 3 rehabilitation centers. I have been told, with great compassion and in several different ways, that I should focus on adapting to my current situation rather than hoping for a different one. She paused. I am done being told what to hope for. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded toward the curtain. Come on back, he said. The problem with Sophia Langford, Mason discovered over the course of the next 3 hours, was that she was brilliant. He had expected, and he knew this was unfair, and he knew it said something about his assumptions. He had expected that she would look at the machine and ask a few basic questions, and perhaps be impressed in a general way. What he had not expected was for her to pick up the control board, examine the microcontroller layout, and say, You're using a modified Kalman filter for the sensor fusion. Where did you learn that? Online course, Mason said. Which one? Coursera. Control Systems Engineering. I did it twice. She set the board down carefully. The algorithm needs work. I know. Specifically the weight shift prediction. The transition from standing to forward momentum is going to be too slow. The user will feel the delay. I know, Mason said. That's what I'm working on. The sensor array needs to be distributed differently, she said. The torso sensors need to be in 3 points, not 2, and they need to talk to the leg actuators on a shorter cycle. 200 milliseconds is too long. You want under 100. Mason stared at her. I have a computer science degree from MIT, Sophia said, with a small amount of the dryness that he was beginning to recognize as her version of humor. And a graduate degree in biomedical engineering. Before I became a CEO, I was an engineer. Your company, Mason said. What does it do? Medical devices primarily. Diagnostic technology, not mobility. She looked at the machine again. I never went this direction because the market analysis didn't support it. The cost-to-outcome ratio for exoskeletal mobility systems has historically been too high for viable commercialization. This isn't about commercialization, Mason said. Something shifted in her face. I know, she said quietly. That's why I came back. Ashsek. They didn't talk about her injury that first session, or the second, or the third. What they talked about was the machine, the technical problems, the solutions, the dead ends, and the workarounds. Sophia had a way of thinking through engineering problems that was different from Mason's, more formal and mathematically rigorous, and he had a way of thinking that was different from hers, built from physical intuition and the accumulated knowledge of a man who understood how things moved in the real world. The combination, Mason was reluctant to admit, was probably better than either of them alone. She came back every Monday and Thursday, after business hours. Her driver waited on the street. She never told Mason why she was coming after hours rather than during the day, and he didn't ask. It was 3 weeks in, on a cold Monday night, when she said, unprompted, I was in the car when it happened, coming back from a dinner. The other driver ran a light. She was looking at the machine when she said it, not at Mason. They told me later that I was in surgery for 6 hours. I don't remember any of that. I remember the dinner. It was a business dinner, some investors. I was closing a Series B round, and I remember being in the car, and then I remember a ceiling, hospital ceiling, very white. She paused. I was told I was lucky. I find that word interesting. Mason didn't say she was lucky. He didn't say she was unlucky either. He said, What was your sister like? Sophia looked at him. My sister? Sorry, I meant Claire. My sister. He was tired, was the thing, and the words had come out in the wrong order. That's who I started building it for. Tell me about her, Sophia said. He did. He'd never told the whole story to anyone outside of family, and even within family they tended not to talk about Claire directly, as though the grief was still too close to touch. But he told Sophia about the scaffold and the fall and the 11 years and the afternoon in March, with the woman jogging past the window, and he told it in the flat, careful way he'd learned to tell things he cared too much about. Sophia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She would have liked this, she said finally. Not you're doing this for the right reasons, or that's a beautiful thing. Just that. She would have liked this. Yeah, Mason said. She would have hated the wiring, though. Claire had opinions about aesthetics. Sophia laughed. That same short, surprised sound. I have opinions about your wiring, too. I know. You've told me. The torso harness looks like something from a horror movie. Function over form. Function doesn't preclude form. She picked up a sketch she'd made of a revised harness design, which was, even on a paper napkin, significantly cleaner than what Mason had built. Can we try this modification this week? They worked until midnight. It was, Mason realized on the way up to the apartment, the longest he'd gone without thinking about the mortgage, or the utilities, or whether Lily's winter coat was going to last another season. His mind had been entirely somewhere else. It was an unusual feeling, and not an unpleasant one. Bahad. The first fitting happened 6 weeks after Sophia's initial visit. Mason had rebuilt the torso harness using Sophia's design, which was, though he would not have said this aloud without being pressed, significantly better than what he'd had before. The leg frames had been recalibrated with a new sensor array configuration that she'd mapped out on a series of index cards, which she'd pinned to the wall above the workbench with the kind of organizational precision that made Mason feel slightly embarrassed about his own filing system. He set the machine up in the center of the workspace, attached to a support frame he'd built from welded pipe, a standing rig that would hold both the machine and the user safely while they tested basic function. Sophia sat in her wheelchair 3 feet away, looking at the exoskeleton with an expression that was doing a great deal of work to stay neutral. "You don't have to," Mason said. "I know," she said. "It hasn't been tested. The simulations look good, but simulations aren't—" "Mason," she looked at him. "Help me get into it." The fitting took 40 minutes. It was not graceful. There were straps that didn't quite reach, adjustments that needed to be made in real time, one moment when the left knee actuator made a sound that neither of them liked. And Mason spent 10 minutes with the casing open before determining it was fine. Sophia held onto the support frame and did not complain, though Mason could see from the set of her jaw that there was some discomfort involved and that she was choosing not to mention it. When it was finally fitted, when all the connections were made and the control unit was showing green across its indicators, Mason stepped back and said, "Okay, I'm going to start the initialization sequence. The machine is going to feel things, weight shifts, breathing, all of that. Don't try to do anything. Just stand." "Just stand," Sophia repeated. "Just stand." The initialization took 90 seconds. During that time, neither of them spoke. Mason watched the sensor readouts on his laptop. Sophia stared at a point on the wall slightly above eye level, her jaw still set, her knuckles white on the support frame. Then the actuators engaged. It wasn't a dramatic thing. It didn't launch her forward or jerk her upright. What it did, very slowly, was take weight. The machine read her body's distribution, processed it through the algorithm, and made minute adjustments to the joint angles in the leg struts. A small shift. Another. And then, very slowly, not all at once, Sophia Langford was standing, not in her wheelchair, not assisted by another person. Standing, with the machine bearing the load that her spine could no longer carry, while she held the support frame and breathed. Mason said nothing. Sophia said nothing. After a long time, she said, "I forgot how tall I was." Her voice was different, not broken. She did not cry. Was not the kind of person who cried easily in front of others, which he had already understood about her, but different, quieter than usual, and less controlled, and that was somehow more moving than tears would have been. 5'7", Mason said, because it was in her medical notes, which she'd shared for the fitting. 5'7.5", she said. "The half matters." "The half matters," he agreed. She stood for 4 minutes before the muscle fatigue in her arms from holding the support frame made her ask to sit. 4 minutes of standing. Mason helped her out of the machine carefully, methodically, and she said nothing further until she was back in her chair. Then she looked at the exoskeleton and at him. "It works," she said. "The standing works," Mason said carefully. "Walking is different. Walking is going to take—" "I know," she said. "I don't care. It works." She put her hands in her lap and looked away for a moment, at the wall, at the wiring diagrams pinned above the bench. "Mason?" "Yeah." "Thank you." He didn't know what to do with that. He was not by nature a person who handled gratitude with any particular grace. He said, "Don't thank me yet. Walking is going to be brutal." "I know," she said. "Good." Walking was brutal. It took 2 months of sessions, Monday and Thursday, occasionally Saturday when Sophia could arrange it, before the machine could safely attempt forward locomotion. 2 months of recalibration, of software updates written at 2 in the morning, of sensor arrays that had to be repositioned 3 times before they read body weight shifts accurately enough to be trusted. 2 months during which Mason also ran a garage, raised a daughter, replaced 3 alternators and 2 timing belts, and 1 transmission that had basically committed mechanical suicide and slept approximately 6 hours a night if things went well. The first walking attempt ended in 12 seconds when the right knee actuator overcorrected a weight shift and Sophia lurched sideways into the support frame with enough force to bruise her shoulder. Mason caught the frame. Sophia said a word that Lily would not have been allowed to say. "Okay," Mason said. "Okay," Sophia agreed through her teeth. Again. The second attempt lasted 31 seconds. The third lasted 48. By the end of the second week of walking attempts, Sophia could manage 2 full lengths of the workspace, 20 feet each way, before the fatigue in her shoulders from working with the support handles overwhelmed the progress. She was getting stronger, which was real and measurable and not nothing. The spinal injury hadn't affected her upper body, and the work of operating with the machine was building muscle in her core and her arms and her back in ways that her physical therapists at the rehabilitation center, who did not know she was doing this and who she had told nothing about it, would have approved of. What she was also doing, which was harder to measure, was learning to trust the machine. And Mason was learning to see what it saw, to watch her shift her weight, and anticipate what the sensors would read, to understand the small tells in her posture that preceded a stumble, to be there without being in the way. They didn't talk a great deal while working. What they said was mostly functional. Can you adjust the left hip joint? Try taking a longer step. How does the transition feel? What they didn't say was everything else, which accumulated between sessions and sat in the workspace like a third presence. Lily knew something was happening. She was 7, and she was perceptive in ways that 7-year-olds sometimes are when they've had to pay close attention to an adult from an early age. She knew that her father was going to the garage late on more nights than usual, and that he sometimes came back upstairs with a different kind of tiredness on his face, not depleted, but wrung out in a way that was subtly better. "Is the project going good?" she asked one morning over her cereal. "It's going well," Mason said. "Grammar? Is the project going well?" "Yeah, getting there." "Is Aunt Claire going to walk?" Mason paused. He told Lily the project was for Claire, which was the honest truth and also not the complete current truth. He thought for a moment. "There's someone else," he said. "Someone who's going to try it first." Lily considered this. "Is she nice?" "She's pretty direct," Mason said. "That's not what I asked." Mason looked at his daughter. "Yeah," he said. "She's nice." Lily went back to her cereal with the satisfaction of someone who has confirmed a thing they already knew. Mason drank his coffee and did not examine his own answer too carefully. 10 weeks into the walking sessions, Sophia let go of the support frame. It was not planned. They were doing a standard pass. Mason tracking the sensor data on the laptop, Sophia moving along the workspace in the machine, and she made a decision. She could feel it in the moment she did it, the slight shift in her hands from gripping to resting to releasing. And then she was walking without holding on to anything, the machine moving with her and under her and around her, and the workspace was very quiet. She made it 8 steps before the machine detected a stumble risk and locked the knee joints, and she reached for the support frame automatically, and Mason was there. 8 steps, he said. 8 steps, she agreed. She was breathing harder than the physical effort warranted. "I wasn't going to tell you I was going to do that." "I know, I saw you decide." She looked at him. "You saw me decide." "I've watched you enough to know what it looks like," he said. Then he went back to the laptop because that felt like enough to have said. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How does Lily like school?" It was the first time she'd asked about his daughter directly. He'd mentioned her. The name had come up in the way that the important parts of a life come up sideways in conversation, but Sophia had not, until now, asked. "She likes math," Mason said. "She thinks reading is fine, but math is good. She wants to be an engineer." "Tell her she should be one," Sophia said. "She doesn't need telling. She's already decided." Sophia smiled, a real one, the kind that was still slightly rare, that he found himself registering when it happened. "Good," she said. "She sounds like my kind of person." "Don't tell her that. She'll want to meet you, and then she'll start critiquing the sensor array, and I can't handle both of you doing that at once." Sophia laughed, and Mason went back to the data, and the workspace held its particular warmth, and outside Brooklyn moved through its ordinary November night, not knowing and not needing to know what was being built in the back of a mechanic's garage on Flatbush Avenue. The thing about building something important in secret is that the secret eventually gets too heavy. Mason had been careful. Sophia had been careful. She'd arranged her Monday and Thursday evenings with the specificity of someone who had built careful arrangements before, and her father's staff were not, from what Mason could tell, the type to ask questions. Gerald Langford ran his family with the same expectations he applied to his business: results, delivered without too much visibility into the process. But Gerald Langford had not gotten where he was by being unobservant. It was a Saturday evening in late January when Mason's phone buzzed with a text from Sophia's number that said simply, "He's having me followed. I need to tell you." Mason had read it at the workbench over a cup of the gas station coffee and thought about what that meant for approximately 30 seconds before deciding it didn't change anything and going back to calibrating the right hip joint. The machine was almost ready. Not almost in the way that optimism uses the word. Almost in the way that a man who is careful about his terminology uses it. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3, and it would be ready to do what it was supposed to do. Walk. Not in a workshop with a support frame 3 feet away and a laptop tracking sensor data in real time. Actually walk. Outside. In the world. He thought about Claire running down the block. Even slow. Even just down the block. He set the wrench down and texted back. "Okay. Does it change anything?" A minute passed. Then, "Not for me. Does it change anything for you?" He thought about Lily asleep upstairs. He thought about what he'd built and what it could do and what it meant. He thought about Gerald Langford's coat and his posture and the check he'd written for the alternator without blinking. He texted back, "No," and went back to work. It. The first time Sophia walked unaided, without the support frame, without Mason standing within arm's reach, without anything to grab. She walked 11 steps in a straight line across the center of the workspace, turned slightly, and made it 4 more before she wobbled and caught the wall with one hand. 15 steps. Mason had been standing at the bench, watching. He didn't clap. He didn't say anything profound. He said, "Stride length was good on steps 7 through 10. You were leaning left after the turn." "I know," Sophia said. She was flushed, which happened when she pushed hard, and which he had learned to read as a sign of effort rather than distress. "Run it again." "You want to run it again? You've done 6 passes already." "I want to run it again." He adjusted his settings on the laptop, and she went back to the start position, and she ran it again. 13 steps this time, which was less than the first attempt. But the form was better and the lean on the turn was corrected, and Mason noted both things without commenting on the lower number. "Let's stop there," he said. "One more. Sophia." She stopped. She looked at him. "You walked 15 steps tonight," Mason said. 3 weeks ago you were managing 8. Stop. Let the machine learn what it did right tonight, and so will you." He paused. "You can push again Thursday." She held his gaze for a moment, the familiar refusal forming on her face, and then something in it shifted. The same shift he'd seen happen before. The decision not to fight the thing that was actually on her side. She nodded. While she was getting out of the machine, she said, "My father knows I'm coming here." "I figured." "He hasn't said anything yet, but he will." She paused, working at a strap. "He's going to think you're taking advantage of me." Mason said nothing. "I'm telling you so you're not surprised," she said. "Not because it's accurate, just because he's going to think it." "What do you think?" Mason said. She looked up. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are the only person in the past 2 years who has spoken to me as though I'm still a person with a future. And I think that's worth considerably more than you know." The workspace was very quiet. Mason handed her a water bottle. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. She went back through the garage to where her driver was waiting, and Mason stood alone in the back room for a while, among the wiring and the foam padding and the instrument of 3 years of work and grief and determination, and thought about futures. He thought about Lily wanting to be an engineer. He thought about Claire and the window in March. He turned off the space heater and the bench light and went upstairs. In the morning, the machine would be waiting. It was always waiting. And now, for the first time, it had actually started to answer back. Thursday came with freezing rain and a busted pipe under the sink in the apartment upstairs that Mason discovered at 5:45 in the morning when he stepped in 2 inches of cold water on his way to make coffee. By 7, he had the pipe patched with a compression fitting that would hold for a few weeks if he was lucky. By 8, he had Lily fed and on the school bus, and by 8:30, he was under a Subaru Outback with a failing CV joint and the particular kind of headache that comes from starting the day wet and cold and not yet caffeinated. The rain kept the walk-in customers away, which was the one thing working in his favor. He finished the Subaru by noon, ate a sandwich standing at the parts desk, and spent the afternoon on an oil change and a set of winter tires for a regular customer named Patrick, who talked too much about his fantasy football league, but tipped well. By 6 o'clock, the rain had thinned to a mist, and Mason had cleared enough of the day's debris. Invoices, parts packaging, Patrick's oversharing, to feel like a human being again. He was reorganizing the sensor array on the workbench when Sophia arrived at 6:40. She came in through the side door the way she always did now, without knocking, because somewhere in the last several weeks that had become unnecessary. She had her hair down tonight, which was unusual. She almost always wore it pulled back for the sessions, practical about things that could be made practical. She looked tired in a specific way, the kind of tired that doesn't come from not sleeping, but from spending a day in rooms full of people who want things from you. "Bad day?" Mason said, without looking up from the array. "Productive day," she said, which is not the same as a good one. She set her bag on the chair by the door and moved to where she could see the bench. "What are you fixing?" "Not fixing. Repositioning the thoracic sensors." "I've been looking at the data from Tuesday, and there's a pattern in the stumble events. They're all preceded by a lag in the upper body read, which means the torso array isn't catching the weight shift early enough. If I move the center sensor up about 2 inches, the algorithm should have another 30 milliseconds of warning." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been going through 2 sessions ago's data all week." "When I have time." "That's..." She stopped. "What?" "Nothing. It's nothing. Show me what you're repositioning." He showed her. She leaned in and looked at the array placement and made the small sound she made when she was processing something, not quite a hum, more of an exhale through the nose, and then said, "You'll need to rerun the calibration if you move the center node. The algorithm weights that node's input differently from the shoulder nodes." "I know. I have a recalibration script ready. It'll take about 20 minutes once it's repositioned." "Can I help?" He handed her a small Phillips screwdriver without comment. They worked side by side at the bench for a while, the repositioning taking longer than it should have because the mounting bracket for the center sensor was slightly corroded and didn't want to release. Sophia held the array steady while Mason worked the bracket, and neither of them talked, and the workspace was warm from the space heater and the mist pressed against the small window above the bench. "My father called me at 4 o'clock today," Sophia said eventually. Mason didn't stop working. "What did he say?" "He knows your name. He knows the garage address. He knows I've been coming here twice a week for 3 months. She paused. "He had someone pull your business records. He knows about the bankruptcy you filed 6 years ago." Mason got the bracket free. He set the screwdriver down and looked at her. "The bankruptcy was because of my sister's medical bills," he said. The flatness in his voice was not anger exactly, just the particular tone that certain facts produce when they've been carried long enough to become heavy. "I know that," Sophia said. "I already know that. He doesn't." "Is he going to be a problem?" She looked at the sensor array in her hands. "My father has a very specific picture of the world," she said carefully. "In that picture, a man in his situation..." She nodded toward the garage, toward the lift and the parts wall and the rubber ramp by the door. "Does not have anything to offer a woman in my situation, except the opportunity to be taken advantage of." "That's a hard picture to live inside," Mason said. "He built it over 60 years. It fits well." She handed him the array. "He's not a bad person. He's a very specific kind of person. He loves me in the way that very specific people love things, by trying to keep them safe from anything they don't understand." Mason positioned the center sensor in its new mount and held it while she tightened the bracket screw. "What did you tell him?" he said. "That I was pursuing a private rehabilitation option and that it was my decision and my risk to manage." She finished the screw and sat back. He asked if I was being emotionally rational. "What does that mean?" "It means he thinks I'm too desperate to see clearly." She said it without visible emotion, the way she said most things that had already been felt and filed. "He's not entirely wrong that I'm desperate. He's wrong about what I'm seeing." Mason ran the recalibration script. The laptop fan spun up. The 20 minutes passed in the way that calibration time always passed. He watching the progress on the screen, she looking at her own notes on the tablet she always brought. occasionally asking a question about the data outputs and the workspace holding its warm, particular quiet. At the end of the 20 minutes, Mason said, "You ready to try it?" "Yes," she said. She had already moved to the fitting area. Musin. The session was better than Tuesday's, significantly better. The 30 extra milliseconds that the reposition sensor bought them showed up immediately in the stumble data. 2 stumble risk events during the first pass, compared to 7 in the equivalent segment last week, and both of the 2 were caught cleanly by the algorithm rather than requiring Mason's intervention. Sophia felt the difference too. He could tell by the way she moved, slightly less braced, slightly more trusting of the machine's response. She made 22 steps on her 4th pass before she chose to stop, which was not a stumble but a choice, and the distinction mattered. 22, Mason said. 22, she said. Best we've done. I know. She was quiet for a moment, standing in the machine with the support frame within reach but not being held. Standing. She did that sometimes, just stood for a moment before sitting back down, the way that people do when they have something they are not ready to give up yet. It felt different tonight, more responsive, less like it's catching me and more like it's just there. That's what we want, Mason said. Eventually you shouldn't think about the machine at all. It should just be walking. That's a long way off. It's closer than 3 months ago. She looked at him, in the direct, measured way that was becoming familiar, the look that meant she was deciding how much of something to say. Yes, she said. It is. She sat back down into her chair, and Mason began the defitting, working through the strap releases with the practiced efficiency of 3 months of doing it. Neither of them rushed. Rushing the defit caused problems. He'd learned that early, a pinched sensor cable that had taken an afternoon to diagnose. He's going to come here, Sophia said, while he was working on the left leg brace. My father. It's not a threat, I want you to know. He won't be able to help himself. Okay, Mason said. He might be difficult. Most people are when they're scared, Mason said. He freed the left brace and set it carefully on the rack. What's he scared of? Sophia was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, that I'm going to get hurt again. That's the whole thing, really. He watched me be hurt very badly, and he couldn't do anything about it, and it broke something in him that hasn't healed. She looked at her hands in her lap. He builds walls when he's broken. Very expensive, very effective walls. Mason finished the right brace. And you? He said. What do you build? She looked up. The question surprised her, but he could see it. I used to build plans, she said. Contingencies, roadmaps. I was very good at having a plan for the plan failing. A pause. I didn't have a plan for this. For which part? She looked around the workspace, the bench, the rack, the machine on its stand. Any of it, she said. I didn't plan for any of this. Mason nodded. He rolled the support frame to the side and picked up the laptop to log the session data. In the corner, the space heater ticked in the cold. Lily wants to meet you, he said. It came out more directly than he'd intended. Sophia looked at him. You told her about me? She asked. She has a habit of asking things directly and waiting as long as it takes. She sounds like someone I know. I told her you were nice, Mason said. She was satisfied with that. Sophia's expression did something complicated, opened and then partly closed again, the way expressions do when they involve something that matters more than expected. I'd like to meet her, she said carefully. If that's Saturday morning, he said. She helps me open the garage. You could come by for coffee. The gas station coffee? I can get better coffee, he said. You don't have to. I know, he said. I'm choosing to. Sophia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Saturday morning. And it was an agreement, and they went on to the next thing, which was reviewing the session data, and neither of them made it into more than it was or less than it was either. Saturday morning, Lily was up at 6:10, which was 5 minutes early, and she came downstairs and made her cereal and then said, Is the lady coming today? Her name is Sophia, Mason said. And yes. What time? I said 9. That's 3 hours. I'm aware. Lily ate her cereal and looked at the garage door and said, "Should I change my shirt?" Mason looked at his daughter's shirt, which had a cartoon dinosaur on it and a small stain near the collar from Wednesday's lunch that he had failed to notice until this exact moment. "Probably yes," he said. "Which shirt?" "Your judgment," he said. "You have good judgment." She went upstairs and came back in a striped long sleeve that was clean and presentable and that she had chosen without asking further questions, which confirmed his opinion of her judgment. She helped him open the bay doors, and they didn't talk much, which was comfortable in the way that shared work is comfortable. And by 8:30, Mason had driven 3 blocks to the coffee place on Courtlew Road that he didn't go to because it cost $4 for a cup, and he had never been able to make himself care enough about coffee to spend $4 on it. But he went now and bought 3 cups, 1 black, 1 with oat milk, and 1 sugar for Sophia based on a reasonable guess, and a hot chocolate for Lily because Lily didn't drink coffee and looked deeply skeptical of the enterprise of coffee in general. He got back at 8:50 and Sophia's SUV was already parked on the street. She was inside in the waiting area talking to Lily. Or rather, Lily was talking to Sophia, with the focused, rapid-fire quality that Lily employed when she had identified someone as worth talking to, which did not happen with everyone. She was explaining the CV joint he'd replaced on the Subaru. She had watched some of it through the window and had retained more than he would have expected, and Sophia was listening with genuine attention, not the patient, polite attention of an adult indulging a child, but the actual kind, asking questions in the gaps. And he said the inner joint was more worn than the outer one, which means the car had a pulling problem for a long time before the person noticed, because people don't pay attention, Lily said. "Do you pay attention to your car?" "I have a driver," Sophia said, "so I rely on him to pay attention." Lily considered this. "That seems like a lot of trust." "It is," Sophia agreed. "I've thought about that." Lily nodded approvingly. Then she saw Mason and said, "You got the good coffee." "I got coffee," Mason said, "from Courtlew Road. I can tell from the cups." He handed Sophia hers, black, because she hadn't specified and black seemed right, and she took it with a slight lift of her eyebrow that might have been about the temperature or might have been about something else. "Good call," she said. She meant the black. Lily was looking between the two of them with the particular sharp look of a 7-year-old who is assembling information. Mason was very familiar with this look and did not find it comfortable. He pointed toward the back of the garage and said, "You want to see the machine? You haven't seen it since—" "Can I?" Lily said, already moving. "Don't touch anything." I know. They went through the curtain together, all 3 of them, and Lily went immediately to the workbench and studied the sensor array without touching it, and Sophia moved alongside and said, "You can see where the center node is repositioned. There, the one in the slightly different bracket." "Why is it higher?" Lily asked. "Because the weight shift information from the torso needs to reach the knee actuators faster. The higher position gives the algorithm more time." Lily looked at the array, then at Sophia, with an expression of thorough assessment. "Dad said you're an engineer." "I was. Now I run a company." "Are you still an engineer?" Sophia paused at that. A real pause, the kind that means a question has landed somewhere genuine. "I think," she said, "that once you're an engineer, you don't stop being one. You just do different things with it." Lily turned back to the array. "I'm going to be an engineer," she said. "Probably robotics, or maybe aerospace. I haven't decided. Both are good choices." "Do you think women are taken seriously in aerospace?" Sophia looked at Mason. Mason looked at his coffee. Sophia looked back at Lily and said, "Some places yes, some places no. And the places that don't take you seriously are wrong, and you'll encounter them, and the way to handle them is to be too good to ignore." Lily processed this. "That's practical advice," she said. "I've had practice giving it." Lily seemed satisfied. She moved on to examining the leg frame on the rack, careful not to touch, and Sophia caught Mason's eye, and the look that passed between them was brief and complicated, and neither of them said anything about it. On a Tuesday in early March, Sophia came to the garage, and she was different in a way that was hard to immediately locate. She was quieter than usual, and the quiet wasn't the focused working quiet that Mason had become fluent in over the months. It was something flatter, more internal. He didn't ask right away. He'd learned that she told things when she was ready to tell them, and that asking before that point produced a version of the truth that had been more prepared than it needed to be. He got the machine ready. She fitted in. They ran through 2 passes, which were technically fine, 24 steps, 27, but the quality of her attention was elsewhere. On the second rest, he said, "What happened?" It wasn't a question, and she seemed to appreciate that. "My board," she said. "There are 3 members who've been talking to each other. They think the company is being mismanaged." She looked at the wall. "They think the CEO is—" She paused. "Distracted. Emotionally compromised since the accident. Are they looking to replace you?" "They're not there yet. They're in the stage where they plant seeds and wait." She flexed her hands on the support frame handles, a small, involuntary movement. "The company is actually performing well. Quarterly earnings are strong. But they have a narrative, and they're building it, and narratives, once they get going, are hard to stop with numbers." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," she said, which was rare. Sophia almost always knew, or presented as knowing. "I'm not sure if I should fight it directly or let it run out of steam. If I fight it directly, I confirm the narrative. I'm reactive, I'm defensive, I'm not thinking clearly. If I ignore it, I look like I don't know what's happening, which is worse. What does your instinct say?" She looked at him. "My instinct says that the member driving it, Hargrove, he's been on the board for 8 years. He built his seat on the back of my father's support, is scared of me specifically. Not of what I've become since the accident, of what I was before it. He always thought I moved too fast and he was always outvoted." She stopped. "If I can get the other 2 to separate from him, his narrative falls apart." "Can you?" "Maybe. One of them I can talk to directly. The other one is harder." She paused again. "I keep thinking I should tell my father. He'd know how to handle Hargrove. But telling him means having a conversation about why I haven't been running the company the way I was running it before. And that conversation leads back here, and I'm not ready to—" She stopped. "Not ready to what?" Mason said. She looked at the machine, at the leg frames encasing her legs. "Not ready to explain this," she said. "To explain that this is the thing I'm spending my energy on, that this is what I care about." She met his eyes. "Because once I explain it, people will have opinions about it, and right now it's mine. It's ours." She caught herself on the word. He could see it, the slight recalibration. "It's something I don't have to defend yet." Mason was quiet for a moment. He understood this with a precision that surprised him. The need to keep something intact before the world's opinions got to it. He'd built the machine in the back room for 3 years without telling anyone outside his family. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because it was his in a way that required protection. "My sister used to say," he said, "that some things need to be seeds before they can be trees. You can't show everyone a seed. They can't see what it's going to be. They only see what it is." Sophia looked at him. "Claire had a lot of opinions about everything," he said. "Some of them were actually useful." A beat. Then Sophia said, "I wish I'd known her." "She would have liked you," Mason said. "She had no patience for people who performed. She would have seen through that in about 4 minutes and gone straight to the part of you that actually worked, which is probably this part." He nodded at the machine, at the workspace. "She would have driven you insane within 2 hours. But she would have liked you." Sophia laughed. "The real one. The surprised one." "I can work with 2 hours," she said. "Ready for another pass?" "Yes." She shifted her weight. The machine read it and adjusted. "Mason." "Yeah. Thank you for listening. I don't do that with most people. Talk about things that aren't resolved." "I know," he said. "I won't tell anyone." "I know you won't," she said simply. "That's why I do."
It's in some
Easy. So she took her first step, and the machine moved with her, and Mason tracked the data and said nothing more. An outside march pressed its cold gray face against the small window above the bench, and the city moved through its business. And in the back of a garage on Flatbush Avenue, 2 people continued building something together that neither of them had a clean word for yet. The morning Gerald Langford came to the garage was a Thursday at 7:42 before business hours, which meant he had planned it specifically that way. Early enough to catch Mason without the buffer of customers, late enough to be civil about it. Mason had just gotten Lily on the bus. He was walking back from the corner with his hands in his jacket pockets when he saw the Mercedes parked in front of the bay doors. Different car from the one with the alternator, new model, and Gerald Langford standing in front of it with his hands in the pockets of his coat, looking at the garage sign. "Mr. Langford," Mason said. "Mr. Reed," Gerald said. He had the tone of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was going to have it in the order he had prepared. "I wonder if you have a few minutes?" "I have until 8, Mason said. He unlocked the side door. "Come in." He didn't offer coffee. He thought about it and then decided that offering the gas station coffee to this man was a kind of comedy he didn't have the energy for this morning. He leaned against the service desk and waited. Gerald Langford looked around the front of the garage. The lifts, the parts wall, the computer, with the careful, measuring look of a man who does not assess things carelessly. Then he looked at Mason with the same look. "My daughter has been coming here for 4 months, he said. "Yes." "Without my knowledge." "She's an adult," Mason said. "Her choice." "She is," Gerald said. "She is an adult. She's also—" He stopped. The stop was real, not performed, something that interrupted whatever he'd planned to say next. He started again. "She was in a wheelchair for 2 years. She saw the best specialists in the country. She was told, clearly and repeatedly, that her injury was complete and that recovery of motor function was not expected. And she spent 4 months in a mechanic's garage anyway." He looked at Mason steadily. "I want to understand why." "You should ask her," Mason said. "I'm asking you." "With respect," Mason said. "It's her story. I'm not going to tell it to you." Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Mason held the look. He was not comfortable and he didn't pretend to be, but he didn't look away either. "Are you in a relationship with my daughter?" Gerald said. "No," Mason said. "Are you financially compensated for whatever it is you've been doing back there?" He nodded toward the curtain. "No." "Then what is your interest?" Gerald said. "What is it that you want from this?" Mason considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer even if the man asking it was testing him. "I built something," he said. "I built it for a long time, for a specific reason, and it needed to be tested. Your daughter volunteered. She understood the risks." He paused. "She's getting better." Gerald stared at him. "Getting better," he repeated. "Better than she was 4 months ago. Significantly." Something moved across Gerald Langford's face, the same thing that had moved across Sophia's face the night of the first fitting when she'd said, "I forgot how tall I was." A thing that had been held under careful pressure for a very long time, shifting suddenly. "Show me," he said. "That's not my decision," Mason said. "Talk to Sophia." Gerald looked at him for another long moment. Then he nodded, once a small, precise movement, and went back to his car. Mason stood in the empty front room of the garage and let out a slow breath. In the workspace behind the curtain, the machine sat on its rack, waiting in the quiet the way it always waited, patient as something that has nowhere else to be. Sophia did not call her father back that Thursday. She knew he'd gone to the garage. He told her in a text that was characteristically brief. "I spoke with Mr. Reed this morning. We should talk." She had read it at her desk at 11:15 between a call with her legal team about the Hargrove situation and a product review meeting she was running at 2, and she had set her phone face down and finished the product review before she allowed herself to think about what it meant that the 2 parts of her life she had been careful to keep separate had now, without her arranging it, touched. She texted Mason that evening. "He came by." Mason texted back, "I know. He asked if we were in a relationship." She stared at that for a moment, then, "What did you say?" "No." "What did you want me to say?" She set her phone down and didn't answer that one. It wasn't a question she was ready to answer, and Mason, to his credit, did not follow it up. He had a rare patience with questions that needed time, which was not a quality she'd encountered often in people who were otherwise as direct as he was. She called her father on Sunday. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered, in the careful, circling way of 2 people who love each other and have learned to be cautious about it, almost everything except the specific things that mattered. Gerald Langford said that he was concerned. Sophia said she understood his concern. Gerald said that she was putting herself at risk. Sophia said she had evaluated the risk. Gerald said that a mechanic in Brooklyn, and he said it in the way that meant more than the words, was not a qualified medical professional. Sophia said she was aware of Mason Reed's professional credentials and that they were not the point. Gerald said then, "What is the point, Sophia?" And there was a roughness in his voice when he said it, a crack in the composure. And that was the thing she had been waiting for, because she could work with the composure, but the crack was the real thing. "The point," she said, "is that I walked 31 steps last Thursday, unassisted. Do you understand what that means? No support frame, no one holding me. 31 steps." The line was quiet. "Sophia," her father said. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me to be careful about hope. I've been careful about hope for 2 years, and it has not served me well." More quiet. Then, "I want to see." "I know," she said. "Not yet." Why not yet? She thought about what Mason had said about seeds and trees, about things that needed to be protected before they could be shown. "Because it's not ready to be seen," she said. "When it is, you'll see it, I promise." Gerald Langford did not like this answer. She knew that from the particular silence that followed it, a silence with weight, with the compressed quality of a man who is accustomed to acting and is choosing not to. But he said, "All right," which was more than she had expected, and they talked for another 10 minutes about the company and the board situation and the ordinary maintenance of a complicated family. And when she hung up, she sat in her apartment for a long time in the specific quiet of a conversation that has gone better than anticipated and left you more tired for it. March turned into April and the sessions accelerated because something had shifted in the machine and in Sophia's relationship with it simultaneously. The way those two things had been shifting in parallel since the beginning and continued to mirror each other in ways Mason tracked without commenting on. The stumble rate was down to near zero on standard passes. She was managing 40 steps consistently, occasionally 50, on the longer runs. The algorithm had learned her specific weight distribution, her stride rhythm, the slight hesitation she had before initiating a turn that had nothing to do with the machine and everything to do with 2 years of a body that expected to fall. That hesitation was the last problem, and it was not an engineering problem. "It's a trust problem," Mason said one evening in mid-April, after she had stalled on the third pass at the same point. The turn near the back wall, the same place every time, where she slowed and braced and the machine misread the hesitation as a stumble risk and locked momentarily, which confirmed her body's caution and created a loop. "I know it's a trust problem," Sophia said. She was frustrated in the specific way she got frustrated when the problem was herself rather than something external, tighter, more internal, less available to be worked on directly. That doesn't make it easier to solve. "What are you afraid of?" In that specific moment, she looked at the turn. "That the floor isn't where I think it is," she said. "It's not rational. I know where the floor is. But in that moment, before the turn, my body thinks the ground is going to disappear." Mason was quiet for a moment. He walked over to the turn point, the worn patch of concrete near the back wall where she always slowed, and stood there. He looked at the floor, then he said, "When Lily was learning to ride a bike, she kept falling at the same place, the end of the driveway where the concrete meets the alley pavement. There's a small height difference, maybe half an inch. She could see it. She knew it was half an inch. But every time she got near it, she braked." Sophia watched him. "We spent a whole afternoon just riding up to the edge and stopping," he said. "Not crossing it, just getting close and stopping, over and over until the place stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like a place." He looked at her. "You want to try that? Just approaching the turn. Not doing it. Just walking to it and stopping." She thought about it. "That seems slow." "It seems slow," he agreed. She did it anyway, because she had long since learned that the things Mason suggested that seemed slow were usually necessary. They spent 20 minutes just walking to the turn, 15 steps each time, stopping, returning to the start. No turn, no completion. Just the approach and the stop, over and over, until her body's alarm at that particular point of floor began, gradually and reluctantly, to quiet. On the 5th actual pass after those 20 minutes, she turned cleanly. 48 steps. Full pass, full turn, no lock, no hesitation. She stood at the end of the workspace for a moment, facing the wall, and Mason saw her shoulders drop. Not collapse, just drop, releasing something that had been held rigid for a long time. Then she turned around without the machine's help, which was new, which was the machine reading a voluntary rotation for the first time, and walked back. "Did you?" she started. "Yeah," Mason said. "I saw it." She sat down into her chair and put her hands flat on her thighs and did not say anything for a while. Mason saved the session data and didn't fill the silence with anything because some silences were doing work that words would interrupt. After a while, she said, "How did you know the bike thing would help?" "I didn't," Mason said. "Lily figured it out herself. I just watched her figure it out and remembered it." Sophia looked at him. "You do that a lot," she said. "Remember things that seem small and turn out not to be." "I pay attention," he said. "Not a complicated skill, just a choice." She considered this. "It's more complicated than you think," she said. "Most people pay attention to what they've already decided is important. You pay attention to everything and then decide." She paused. "It's different." Mason picked up the laptop case. "It's just how my brain works," he said. He said it in the flat, slightly uncomfortable way of someone being described accurately and not being sure what to do with the accuracy. "Don't dismiss it," she said, mildly but with enough firmness that he looked up. "I'm not. You are. You deflect when someone says something true about you. You've done it before." He looked at her. "You've cataloged my deflections?" "I pay attention too," she said, "just in different directions." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Fair enough," and started shutting down the laptop, and they moved on to the next thing, which was the way they always handled something that had landed somewhere it needed to settle before it could be examined further. The board situation at Langford Technologies came to a head in the last week of April. Sophia had known it was coming, had watched the signs with the same careful, preemptive attention she brought to everything that threatened the things she'd built. But knowing something is coming and being ready for it are different problems. She had dinner with the board member she trusted, a woman named Patricia Wren, who had been in the tech industry for 30 years and had no patience for politics conducted through implication. Patricia had told her, over expensive food that neither of them ate much of, that Hargrove had recruited the second wavering member and was circling toward a formal motion. "He wants to restructure the executive committee," Patricia said. "Put a co-CEO in place, call it a temporary capacity measure." "Temporary," Sophia said. "That's the word he's using." "And the board would vote for it?" "He has 3, Patricia said. "He needs 4. He's working on Kimura." Kimura was David Kimura, who had joined the board 18 months ago and was still, in Sophia's assessment, deciding who he was in a room full of established players. Hargrove would be offering him something. A role in the restructured executive structure, probably. A way to matter more. "I need to talk to Kimura," Sophia said. "Directly," Patricia agreed. "Not through intermediaries. He needs to feel that you see him." "I do see him." "Then show him," Patricia said. She picked up her fork, looked at her food, and put it down again. "Sophia, how are you, actually? Because you look different than you did 6 months ago. And I can't tell if it's better or worse, and I've been trying to figure it out all through dinner." Sophia considered deflecting. She was very good at deflecting. She had a range of precise, plausible deflections that she had employed over 2 years of people asking how she was, actually, and most of them worked because most people didn't want a real answer. They wanted a satisfying one. Patricia Wren wanted a real one. "Better," Sophia said. "I think it's better." "Something changed." "Yes. The rehabilitation thing your father mentioned." "He mentioned it?" "He's worried. He mentioned it." Patricia looked at her steadily. "He said a mechanic in Brooklyn." He said it like that, I assume, with the pauses. "Yes." Patricia waited. Sophia set down her own fork. "I'll tell you the real version," she said, "but I need you to not tell my father any part of it that he doesn't already know, because I'm not ready for that conversation yet." Patricia agreed, and Sophia told her. "Not everything." She was still learning which things needed to be shared and which needed to be held a while longer, but enough. The machine, the sessions, the progress. 48 steps with a clean turn. Patricia listened with the focused, clean attention of a person who has spent a career making decisions and knows that information is the only thing that's actually useful. When Sophia finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Hargrove would use this. If he knew." "I know." The narrative writes itself. CEO skipping board responsibilities to test unauthorized medical technology in a mechanic's garage. Emotional decision-making, diminished judgment. "I know," Sophia said. That's why I'm telling you and not anyone else." And the mechanic? What does he want from this? It was the same question her father had asked, in the same tone, and Sophia felt the same steadiness in her answer that she always felt when someone asked it. "Nothing," she said. "That's the thing that no one can quite believe, but it's true. He wants the machine to work. That's what he wants." Patricia looked at her for a long time. "All right," she said finally. "Let me tell you what we're going to do about Hargrove." Mason found out about the board situation not from Sophia, but from Lily. This was not because Lily had been told anything confidential. She hadn't, Sophia was careful, but because Lily had, over the course of several Saturday mornings, developed an easy and remarkably direct rapport with Sophia that Mason was not always present for, since the two of them had fallen into a habit of talking at the bench while Mason was doing the early maintenance checks on the current project cars. On a Saturday morning in early May, Lily came to find Mason in the bay and said, "Is Sophia's job in trouble?" Mason looked up from the car he was under. "Why?" She seemed stressed, more than usual, and she was looking at her phone a lot, which she usually doesn't do when she's here. She usually doesn't do what? Look at her phone. She usually turns it over when she's here. Today she didn't. Mason came out from under the car. He looked at his daughter for a moment. "Where is she?" "Bench. She's looking at the machine." He went through the curtain. Sophia was parked at the workbench with her tablet face up, not the machine's tablet, her work one. And she was reading something with the flat, controlled expression that he had come to recognize as the face she put over things that were actually unsettled. "Talk," he said. She looked up. "Lily sent you." Lily noticed. "I came myself." She set the tablet down. "Hargrove called an emergency board session for next Friday. He has 4 votes. She said it the way you say a thing when you've already processed the worst of it, and what's left is just the logistics. He's going to propose the co-CEO structure. Patricia thinks she can pull Kimura back before the vote if I can get a meeting with him before Tuesday, but Kimura isn't returning my calls." "Why not?" "Because Hargrove got to him first and told him that I don't know exactly what he told him. Something about my state of mind, something about the accident." She looked at the machine on the rack. "He's using 2 years of my life to argue that I'm not capable of running a company I built." The anger in Mason's chest was immediate and specific, not hot, but solid, the way anger is when it's justified. He didn't act on it. He sat on the stool and said, "What do you need?" "I need Kimura to take my call," she said. "And I need—" She stopped. "I don't know what else I need. I'm usually better at this. I usually know the next 3 steps and the steps after those. Right now I can see 1 step and the rest is unclear." "That's not nothing," Mason said. "1 step is enough. What's the step?" "Get the meeting with Kimura." "How?" "I don't know yet. He's not in my network directly. He came in through a connection I don't have good access to." She paused. "Unless—" She stopped again. "Unless what?" She looked at him. "My father knows Kimura. They've met at industry events. My father has—" She paused with the deliberateness of someone who is assembling something in real time. Enough standing with Kimura to get a phone call returned. "Then call your father," Mason said. "If I call my father, I have to have the full conversation. The one you're not ready for." "Yes." Mason looked at her. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Gerald Langford in the front room, the way the man's composure had cracked at the mention of 31 steps. He thought about seeds and trees. "Maybe it's time," he said. Sophia looked at him steadily. "You think I should show him?" "I think," Mason said carefully, that you've been protecting something that doesn't need protecting anymore. It survived. It's strong enough to be seen. He paused. And I think your father is going to surprise you. She held his gaze. He could see her working through it. The calculation, the risk assessment, the particular courage that is different from the courage of walking across a floor, harder in its own way because it couldn't be practiced in a workshop at 11 at night. Okay, she said. You want to call him? I want to do the session first, she said. And then I'll call him. She looked at the machine. If I can walk 50 steps tonight, I'll call him. And if you can't? I'll call him anyway, but 50 steps will help. Mason pulled the machine from the rack. Then let's get you to 50 steps, he said. She made 63. It was the best session they'd had. She was angry about Hargrove in a way that had no productive outlet except Ford, and the machine read her body differently when she was angry. Less hesitation, more commitment in the weight shifts, the pre-movement signals sharper and cleaner than usual, so the algorithm had more to work with, and the response was faster. She walked the full length of the workspace, turned, walked back, turned again, and on the fourth pass she stopped counting because counting had become secondary to something else. Mason tracked the data and said nothing until she stopped. 63, he said. She was breathing hard. I know. You stopped thinking about the steps. Somewhere around 35, she said. I was thinking about the board meeting. What were you thinking about it? That Hargrove has spent 8 years being threatened by me without ever understanding what I actually am. She looked at the wall. He saw the accident and thought it finished me. He doesn't understand that the things that finish some people just reorganize others. She turned. Voluntary turn. Smooth, the machine adjusting without her needing to think about it, and looked at Mason. I built this company from $30,000 and a rented desk. I built it through 2 investor rejections and a lawsuit and a product recall in year 3 that I thought was going to sink us. 1 board member with 4 votes is not going to... She stopped. Something in her face shifted. Sorry, you don't need to hear me work through this. I don't mind, Mason said. I'm using you as a sounding board. I know, I still don't mind. She looked at him. The anger had burned down a little, and what was under it was visible. The tiredness, the genuine worry, and something else that he didn't look at for too long because looking at it directly felt like something that required more than this moment. Sit down, he said. I'll get you water. She sat. He got the water. She drank half of it and held the bottle and said, When this is resolved, the board thing, I want to do an outdoor session. He looked at her. Outside, she said. Actual pavement, actual uneven surface. I want to know if it works in the world or only in here. It'll work, he said. The algorithm was designed for... I know it was designed for it. I want to know if it does. She met his eyes. There's a difference. Yeah, he said. There is. So when this is resolved... When this is resolved, he agreed. She called her father that night. Mason knew because she did it from the garage. She asked if she could stay an hour after the session. She had a call to make, and she wanted to make it somewhere that felt like the right place to make it from, which she said without apparent self-consciousness, and which landed in Mason's chest the way the things she said without apparent self-consciousness always landed. He went upstairs to check on Lily, who was asleep, and he sat at the kitchen table for a while with a glass of water, listening to the faint sound of Sophia's voice through the floor. Not the words, just the rhythm of it, the cadence that moved between measured and unsteady and back to measured, the way conversations about important things always do. After an hour, he heard the side door close. He looked out the window and watched her driver help her into the SUV. She didn't look up. He didn't expect her to. He went to bed and set his alarm for 5:45 and thought, in the minutes before sleep, about the session data, specifically about steps 40 through 63, the section where she had stopped counting, where her body had been moving without the mediation of thought, where the machine had been reading her most clearly because she had stopped second-guessing what she was doing. He had been building the machine for 3 years. He had been building it for Claire, and then for the principle of the thing, and then because it worked, and someone needed it to work. He had not been building it for this. For this particular person, this particular collection of stubbornness and precision, and the surprised laugh and the way she said things that were true about him before he had finished being true about them himself. He was not sure what to do with any of that. He set the alarm and turned the light off and lay in the dark and decided that some things were seeds and that seeds needed time, and that was the last thought he had before sleep took the rest of it. Gerald Langford came to the garage on a Sunday evening in May, by arrangement with Sophia. This was different from his first visit. He was quieter getting out of the car, less the posture of a man who is conducting something, more the posture of a man who is being shown something, which requires a different set of muscles. Sophia came in her own chair, and she and Gerald moved through the side door together, and the geometry of them in the space was the geometry of a father and a daughter who had talked honestly and were still finding the shape of what that had changed. Mason had the machine ready. He had cleaned the workspace more thoroughly than he usually did, not because he was trying to impress Gerald Langford, he told himself, which was largely true. It was more that Gerald Langford was about to see something that deserved to be seen in a space that respected it. He had also, for the first time, hung a small framed photograph on the wall above the workbench. Claire at 20, standing in front of the ocean somewhere in New Jersey, laughing at something out of frame. He'd had the photo for years and never put it up. He put it up Sunday morning without examining the decision too carefully. Gerald looked around the workspace carefully. He looked at the machine on its rack with the particular attention of a man who had spent his life evaluating things, and Mason watched him register the salvaged parts, the careful wiring, the foam padding, the overall quality of something built by one person with limited resources over a very long time. "You built this alone," Gerald said. "Yes." "How long?" 3 years on the current version, about a year of failed versions before that. Gerald looked at the photograph above the bench. He read it without asking. "My sister," Mason said. Gerald nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. He said, "May I see it work?" Mason looked at Sophia. Sophia nodded. The fitting took the usual time. Gerald watched without speaking, and his watching was the attentive, still kind, not fidgeting, not checking his phone. When the initialization sequence ran, the 90 seconds of sensors reading and actuators calibrating, he watched the laptop screen without being invited to. Then Sophia stood. Gerald Langford put his hand against the wall behind him. The smallest movement, the wall holding him up. Sophia walked the length of the workspace, turned, smooth, clean, the hesitation entirely gone, walked back, turned again. She did not look at her father while she walked. She looked at the wall in front of her, at her own forward direction, the way she always looked while the machine was moving with her. On the third pass, she stopped in the center of the space and let go of the air handles she'd been using for balance. She stood without holding anything. Gerald made a sound. It was not a word. It was something below words, the kind of sound that comes out when the body is processing something that the mind hasn't caught up to yet. "Sophia," he said. She looked at him. Her father's face had, broken is not the right word, but it had opened, the careful architecture of it, giving way to something older and less managed. And he crossed the workspace toward her with a speed that surprised Mason. And he put his arms around his daughter very carefully, the way you hold something that has been hurt and is fragile in ways you are still learning. And Sophia held onto him with one hand and kept the other arm out for balance, and the machine held her up through all of it. Mason looked at the photograph of Claire above the bench, the ocean, the laugh. He looked at the floor. He gave them the moment, which was theirs. After a while, Gerald stepped back and looked at his daughter's face and then at Mason's. And whatever he had come here prepared to think about Mason Reed had been rearranged by what he had just watched, and the rearrangement was visible. "What do you need?" Gerald said. To Mason, directly. Mason looked at Sophia. Sophia looked at Mason. "I need the algorithm tested on a wider range of body types," Mason said. "I need a biomedical engineer to review the safety protocols. And I need to figure out if the sensor array can be miniaturized, because the current form factor is too large for practical use." Gerald nodded. He was listening the way men listen when they have already decided to act and are just getting the specifics. "Those are solvable problems," Gerald said. "I know," Mason said, I just need resources I don't have. Gerald looked around the workspace one more time. The bench, the wiring, the photograph, the machine. He looked like a man standing in a place that has corrected him and experiencing the particular mix of chagrin and respect that correction produces in people who are honest enough to feel it. I'll make some calls, he said. Gerald Langford made his calls on Monday morning. Mason knew this because by Monday afternoon he had 3 voicemails from numbers he didn't recognize, 2 emails forwarded through his garage's contact form from people identifying themselves as biomedical engineers, and a handwritten note slipped under the side door that read, "In Gerald's precise, old-fashioned script, Dr. Elaine Cho, NYU, Langone, Mobility Systems Research. She's expecting your call." G.L. Mason looked at the note for a long time. Then he put it on the workbench next to the laptop and went back to the Jeep Cherokee he'd had on the lift since 8 that morning. The thing about Gerald Langford making calls was that it was efficient and it was generous, and it was also, Mason understood clearly, a reorganization of the power structure around the project. Before Sunday evening, the machine existed in a specific world. The back of a garage on Flatbush Avenue, 2 people, a laptop, and enough stubbornness to compensate for everything the project lacked. That world had rules that Mason understood. He knew where the edges were. He knew what he could control. Gerald's calls were the end of that world, and Mason was not entirely sure he was ready for what came after it. He called Sophia that evening instead of calling Dr. Cho. He moved fast, Mason said. He always moves fast when he's decided something, Sophia said. She was in her office. He could hear the particular acoustic of the space, the slight echo that large rooms have. "Are you okay with it?" "I don't know yet," Mason said. "I want to be. I know it's the right next step." But the right next step and the comfortable next step aren't always the same thing. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When I took the company public, I was terrified. Not of the process. I understood the process. I was terrified of what it meant. That it wouldn't just be mine anymore, that anyone with a brokerage account could have an opinion about it." A pause. "I did it anyway because the company needed it, and I was right that it stopped being just mine, but it also became something larger than it could have been otherwise, and that ended up mattering more than the loss." Mason considered this. "Is that what I'm supposed to take from that?" "I'm not prescribing anything. I'm just telling you what my version of this felt like." Her voice shifted slightly. "Your machine is too important to stay in that garage, Mason. You know that." "Yeah," he said, "I know that." "Call Dr. Cho." "I'll call her tomorrow." "Call her tonight." "She told my father she's available until 10. He looked at the note on the workbench. "You already know what she said." "My father briefed me." There was the small, dry note in her voice that was her version of a smile. "Call her. She's going to want to see the system this week. Let her." He called Dr. Cho at 8:15. She picked up on the second ring and said, without preamble, "Tell me about the sensor fusion algorithm." And they talked for an hour and 40 minutes, which was not how Mason had expected the call to go. And by the end of it, he had agreed to a lab visit on Thursday, and Dr. Cho had used the phrase genuinely novel approach twice, in a tone that was the opposite of polite. He went to bed at 11 with the phone still in his hand and lay in the dark thinking about seeds and trees. And for the first time in a long time, the thinking did not feel like worry. It felt like something adjacent to readiness. The board vote happened on a Friday. Mason didn't know the details until Saturday morning, when Sophia came to the garage not for a session, but just to come, arriving at 9:15 with better coffee than his and a look on her face that he had learned to read as the aftermath of something that had required a great deal from her. She told him about it at the bench, both of them with their coffee, the machine on its rack behind them. Patricia had gotten to Kimura. The meeting had happened on Wednesday. Sophia, Kimura, a conference room on the 42nd floor of the Langford Technologies building, 2 hours. Sophia had shown him the quarterly numbers, the product roadmap, the 3 acquisitions she had in preliminary negotiation. She had also, deliberately and without drama, shown him the footage Mason had recorded on his phone 2 weeks earlier. 30 seconds of her walking in the workspace, unassisted, 63 steps. She had shown it not as a bid for sympathy, but as data. "This is what I've been doing with my energy and judgment. Decide for yourself what that tells you." Kimura had voted with Sophia. Hargrove's motion had failed 4-3. He's not done, Sophia said. He'll regroup and find another angle, but this particular play is finished. How do you feel? Mason asked. She thought about this seriously, the way she thought about questions that deserved serious answers. Tired, she said, and clear, like after a hard session. The tiredness is the right kind. She drank her coffee. I showed him the video. I know, you said. I wanted you to know I used it. It wasn't just mine to use. Mason looked at her. I recorded it for reference data, he said. Use it however you need. Still, she held her cup in both hands. Kimura asked about the technology. Specifically, he wanted to know if it was patented. Mason went still. What did you tell him? That it was in development and not yet protected, and that the inventor was in the process of formalizing the IP. She met his eyes. Which you need to do. Before my father's network gets any wider, you need a patent attorney. I can recommend one. I can't afford a patent attorney. Consider it a loan, she said, from me, against future licensing revenue, which will exist because this technology is going to be licensed, Mason. That is not a prediction. It is a certainty. He looked at the machine. The loan. The word sat uncomfortably, the way debts do even when they're offered cleanly. But underneath the discomfort was the bedrock fact that she was right. And Mason had never been the kind of man who rejected correct information because of how it made him feel. Okay, he said. Okay, she repeated, as though confirming that the conversation had happened. Lily appeared from upstairs at 9:40, still in her pajamas, with her hair doing the thing it did in the morning that defied description, and registered Sophia's presence with the particular lack of surprise that had become her standard response to Sophia being at the garage. Did you win? Lily asked. She had been told, in age-appropriate terms, that Sophia had a work problem. Yes, Sophia said. More or less. More or less, Lily repeated, pulling up the stool at the bench with the ease of someone who had done it many times. What's the less? The person who caused the problem is still there. He just lost this round. Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to problems she found genuinely interesting. Dad says when someone keeps causing problems, the real question is what they're afraid of. Because people who aren't afraid of anything don't usually need to cause problems for other people. Sophia looked at Mason. Mason looked at his coffee. Your dad's right, Sophia said. In this case, I think he's afraid of being irrelevant. Then show him he is, Lily said. At something real, so he knows you know. She reached across the bench for a piece of paper and a pencil. She was always drawing things, schematics or animals or combinations of both. And added, without looking up, that's what Dad does when someone disrespects the garage. He just fixes something complicated in front of them and doesn't explain it. Then they stop. The silence that followed this was the specific kind produced by a 7-year-old accidentally summarizing a sophisticated strategy. I'll think about that, Sophia said. Dr. Elaine Cho was 51 years old, had been running NYU Langone's mobility systems lab for 12 years, had published 47 peer-reviewed papers, and had, in Mason's assessment within the first 10 minutes of meeting her, approximately 0 patience for anything she considered imprecise. She arrived at the garage on Thursday evening with a graduate student named Felix, who carried a case of equipment and said almost nothing for the entire 3 hours they were there. Dr. Cho herself said a great deal, most of it in the form of questions, many of them the kind of questions that revealed in their framing that she already understood the answer and was checking whether Mason did. He did. He didn't always use the vocabulary she used. She had the formal language of a career academic, and he had the language of a man who had learned by doing. But when she asked him why he'd chosen distributed sensor fusion over a centralized processing approach, he explained his reasoning clearly, and she said, "Yes, exactly," in a tone that was the highest compliment she apparently gave. She reviewed the algorithm documentation he'd printed, 26 pages of commented code and mathematical notes, and flagged 3 areas of concern and 4 areas she called surprisingly elegant, which Felix wrote down dutifully and which Mason tried not to read too much into. At the 2-hour mark, Dr. Cho looked up from the documentation and said, "You have no formal engineering credentials." "No," Mason said, Your background is automotive mechanics and self-directed study. Yes? She nodded slowly. Not approval, not disapproval. Assessment. The algorithm is cleaner than work I see from graduate students, she said. Partly because you didn't learn any bad habits, and partly because you had a specific problem and solved only that problem. Academic engineers solve problems with awareness of every adjacent problem, and it clutters the work. She set the papers down. The form factor is a significant issue. The current system is not viable for daily use. I know, the miniaturization. My lab has been working on flexible actuator arrays for 4 years. There's an overlap between what we've developed and what your system needs. She looked at him steadily. I'd like to propose a collaboration. You bring the algorithm and the user testing framework. My lab brings the hardware expertise and the resources. She paused. I'll be direct about the structure. You retain IP ownership of the algorithm and the system architecture. My lab contributes under a co-development agreement with publication rights for the research. Gerald Langford has offered to fund the first phase. Mason was quiet for a moment. I need to think about it, he said. Dr. Cho nodded as if she had expected this. Of course. I'll send a draft term sheet by Monday. She stood, which was the signal for Felix to begin packing the equipment case. One more question. Your test subject, the woman who has been using the prototype. Gerald told me she's had significant results. Significant, yes. I'd like to include her in the formal trial design, with her consent, obviously. That's her decision, Mason said. I can ask. Please do. Dr. Cho looked around the workspace one final time. The bench, the machine, the photograph above the bench. Her gaze landed on the photograph for a moment. Motivation matters in this work, she said. The engineers in my lab are motivated by research questions. That produces good science. But it is different from being motivated by a specific face. She looked at Mason. Yours will produce better design. It usually does. She left with Felix and the equipment case, and the side door closed behind them, and Mason stood alone in the workspace. He looked at Claire's photograph. The laugh. The ocean. He sat down on the stool and put his hands flat on the bench and looked at the machine. The term sheet would arrive Monday. The patent attorney consult was set for next Wednesday. Dr. Cho's lab, Gerald's funding, a formal trial. 6 months ago, the machine had been a secret that 2 people kept in the back of a garage. Now it was becoming something with legal structure and institutional partners and a funding source, and the transformation was both necessary and disorienting in the way that all necessary transformations are. He thought about what Sophia had said, that it stopped being just mine, but it also became something larger than it could have been otherwise. He looked at the machine. All right, Claire, he said, to the photograph, to the empty room, to no one in particular. All right. The outdoor session happened on a Sunday morning in early June, before the city got its full heat up, when the light was still slant and gentle, and the sidewalk outside the garage held the particular quiet of an early weekend morning in a neighborhood that kept late hours. Mason had prepared it carefully, not obsessively, but carefully, because the difference between a controlled environment and an actual sidewalk was the difference between a map and the terrain it described, and he was not going to discover the gaps in that difference by being careless. He had walked the block twice the previous evening, noting the seams in the concrete, the slight grade near the corner, the place where a tree root had buckled the pavement into a half-inch ridge. He had adjusted the algorithm's ground irregularity parameters and run a simulation with the irregularity profile. The simulation had looked fine. Simulations were not the terrain. Sophia came at 7:30 before the neighborhood was fully awake. Her driver parked around the corner at her instruction. She had said, without elaboration, that she wanted as little audience as possible for this, which Mason understood and had arranged the space accordingly. It was just them. Lily was upstairs, asleep at 7:30 on a Sunday in the ordinary miracle of a child who could sleep through anything. They fitted the machine inside. The fitting took 12 minutes now. They had done it enough times that the process had a rhythm, each strap in sequence, each connection confirmed in order. While Mason ran the initialization, Sophia looked at the open side door, at the rectangle of morning light on the concrete. If it doesn't work well outside, she said, we know what to fix next. It'll work, Mason said. You don't know that. I'm reasonably confident. Plus, confidence and knowledge are different things, she said, and there was the edge of a smile in it, the particular one that appeared when she was nervous and covering it with precision. You sound like me, he said. I've been spending a lot of time with you. He finished the initialization. All green. He stood and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything about the fact that this was the moment that the 3 years of the garage, the sessions, the algorithm, the sensor arrays, the arguments about calibration timing and harness design, all of it had been pointing toward. Not the first standing, not the 63 steps. This, outside, in the world. Ready? He said. No, she said. Let's go. They went through the side door together. The morning air was cool and carried the smell of the city waking up. Coffee from somewhere nearby, exhaust from a delivery truck turning at the corner, the specific mineral smell of concrete that hasn't yet been warmed by the sun. The sidewalk was exactly as Mason had memorized it. Sophia stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand on the frame, not hesitating, just being in the moment before the moment. Then she stepped out. The machine handled the threshold between the garage floor and the sidewalk with a small adjustment, a fraction of a second where Mason saw the actuators compensate for the height change, and then she was on the sidewalk and the machine was reading the pavement and she was walking. She walked to the corner. 32 steps on real pavement, uneven and varied, and nothing like the smooth concrete of the workspace. The machine compensated for the slope near the corner with the small continuous corrections that it had been trained to make. And he watched her body's response, the slight surprise, the adjustment, the trust. She stopped at the corner and stood and looked at the street. A man walked past with a dog. He glanced at the machine with the mild curiosity of a New Yorker who has seen many things and classified this as merely unusual, and moved on. A taxi went through the intersection. The light changed. Sophia turned and walked back. When she reached the garage door, she stopped. She looked at Mason. He looked at her. Her face was doing what faces do at the end of something that has been long in coming. Not joy, exactly. Too complicated for just that word. And too real. Something that lived below the threshold of what words usually reach. Well, she said. Well, he said. The slope near the corner needs a parameter adjustment. The right hip joint was slightly slow. Musum. I clocked it, he said. 0.3 seconds. I'll fix it tonight. She nodded. She was still standing on the sidewalk, standing outside in the morning, in the world. I want to do it again, she said. How many times? Until I stop wanting to count, she said. They stayed on the block for 40 minutes. She walked to the corner and back 11 times. By the 5th pass, the right hip adjustment had been made via the laptop he'd brought out on a folding table. By the 8th pass, she had stopped looking at her feet and started looking at the street, the buildings. The morning light on the row houses across from the garage. By the 11th pass, she was not counting at all, and Mason had stopped counting too and was just watching her walk. Lily appeared in the side doorway at 8:40 in her pajamas and her morning hair, holding a bowl of cereal, and watched for a moment. It works outside, she said. It works outside, Mason confirmed. Lily nodded, as though this had been the expected result, and went back inside. The patent was filed in July. The term sheet with Dr. Cho's lab was signed 3 days after it arrived, after Mason had spent a weekend reading it twice through and sending it to the patent attorney with a list of questions, most of which the attorney had answered with minor adjustments to the language that satisfied Mason's concerns without changing the substance of the deal. The IP stayed with Mason. The collaboration was clean. Gerald Langford's funding was structured as an investment with defined terms rather than a gift, which Mason had insisted on and which Gerald had accepted without argument, which raised Mason's opinion of him further. What Mason had not anticipated was the speed. Gerald had been right that the problems were solvable. He had not fully accounted for what it meant to have access to people for whom these particular problems were already mostly solved. Dr. Cho's lab had flexible actuator arrays that integrated with the algorithm in 6 weeks of iterative testing. A medical device engineer named Torres, who had worked for a prosthetics company for 15 years, came on board part-time and redesigned the form factor from the ground up over the course of a month, cutting the size by 40% and the weight by a quarter. The second-generation prototype was assembled in Dr. Cho's lab in August. Mason drove to the lab and stood in front of it and felt a specific, uncomfortable emotion that took him a moment to identify. It was pride, which he was not accustomed to feeling without immediately checking it, and underneath the pride was the rawer thing, the original thing, the reason he had started. He looked at the second-generation machine and thought about Claire's apartment in March, the woman jogging past the window, the particular tiredness on his sister's face. He called his mother that evening, which he didn't do often enough, and told her about the patent and the collaboration and the second-generation prototype. His mother was quiet for a long time and then said, "Claire would be so loud about this. She would tell everyone she knew." "I know," Mason said. "She'd take credit for inspiring it." "She'd be right," Mason said. His mother laughed, and then she was crying, not heavily but steadily, the way that old grief cries when it has found something new to attach to. Not loss anymore, but something that is the opposite of loss and hurts the same way from a different direction. Mason held the phone and listened and didn't try to fix it. Sophia's trial began in September. Not just Sophia, Dr. Cho's lab had identified 4 additional trial participants through NYU Langone's rehabilitation network. A 28-year-old woman who had been injured in a diving accident 3 years prior, a 44-year-old veteran whose spinal injury dated to a combat deployment, a 61-year-old man whose injury was the result of a surgical complication, and a 19-year-old who had grown up with a congenital condition that had confined her to a wheelchair from childhood. The consent process had taken a month. The safety protocols had been reviewed by a medical ethics board and revised twice. Mason had been present for all of it, not leading, exactly, but not absent either. He had learned over the summer how to exist in rooms where the vocabulary was different from his, and the institutional authority was held by people with credentials he didn't have, without either deferring entirely or overreaching. It was a balance that required daily recalibration and that he managed imperfectly, which was the only way any difficult balance can be managed. Sophia had helped with this, in the specific way she helped with things, not by managing it for him, but by saying once, in a conversation that had started about the ethics board revision and ended somewhere else, "You belong in the room, Mason. You built the thing in the room. No one else in that room built the thing they're talking about. Don't let the vocabulary make you smaller than you are." He had written that down, which was not something he usually did with things people said to him. He had written it on the back of a parts invoice and pinned it to the workbench. The first trial session with the full participant group was a Tuesday in September. Mason drove to the NYU Langone lab and stood in the observation area with Dr. Cho and Torres and 2 members of the ethics board, and Sophia, who was there not as a patient but as a collaborator, having formally joined the trial as a consultant on patient experience in a role that the lab had not initially proposed and that she had suggested and justified so efficiently that Dr. Cho had agreed within a day. One by one, the trial participants were fitted into the second-generation prototypes. There were 2 systems being rotated, and one by one, with varying degrees of success that Mason watched with the specific attention of someone who has calibrated the difference between a hardware issue and a software issue and an operator issue and a patient issue, they stood. The veteran's name was Carter. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, and he had the watchful, measured quality of someone who had spent years in environments where inattention had consequences. When the machine lifted him to standing, he was still for a moment, looking at the wall in front of him. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Well, huh." And then he laughed. A short, disbelieving sound, the kind of laugh that is actually something else entirely. Mason felt it in his sternum. The 19-year-old, her name was Marisol, and she was studying graphic design, and she had brought her mother to the session, made 3 steps on her first attempt, and then the left knee actuator hesitated, and she grabbed the support bar and said, Wait, it stopped." Mason was at the laptop in 3 seconds, identified the issue as a calibration drift in the left sensor node, corrected it in 90 seconds, and she tried again and made 11 steps. And her mother, who had been standing against the wall with her arms folded in the posture of someone managing hope by not letting it expand too far, unfolded her arms and put both hands over her mouth. The session lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, everyone was tired in the way that significant things make people tired, and the observation room had the feeling of a space where something had happened that would need time to fully understand. On the drive back to Brooklyn, Mason sat in the Jeep in traffic on the BQE and thought about the garage, about the moving blanket curtain and the space heater and the gas station coffee, about the years of working past midnight while Lily slept upstairs, about Sophia the first day, in the waiting room chair, asking whether the coffee was actually bad. His phone buzzed. He looked at it at a red light. Sophia. Carter asked me how long before he can try it outside. Mason. What did you tell him? Sophia. I said ask the engineer. Mason. I'm not an engineer. Sophia. You are the most engineer person I know. Stop arguing about the word. He put the phone at the cup holder and drove the rest of the way home with the window down, and the September air came in off the bridge, and the city spread itself out ahead of him, all noise and light and the ordinary chaos of 10 million lives. And somewhere in all of it, his daughter was doing her homework at the kitchen table and waiting for him to come home. And the machine he had built was standing in a lab across the river teaching 4 people that the ground was not going to disappear. He pulled into the garage at 7:15 and sat in the Jeep for a moment after he turned the engine off. Then he went upstairs. The trial results came in December. Not all at once, science doesn't work that way, and Mason had learned over the course of the fall that institutional processes have their own pace, which is slower than a man working alone at midnight and faster than despair, and somewhere in that range is where real change actually happens. The formal analysis took 6 weeks after the final trial session, and Dr. Cho presented the preliminary findings to the research group on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room at NYU Langone that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, which Mason found oddly comforting. 4 of the 5 participants had achieved functional ambulation with the second-generation system. Carter, the veteran, had progressed the fastest. He had the body awareness of someone who had spent years training physical discipline, and the machine had learned him quickly. By the 8th session, he was walking the length of the lab corridor without the support bar. And by the 12th, he had asked whether the system could be tested on stairs, which it couldn't yet, which Mason had written down as the next engineering problem on a list that was getting longer rather than shorter. Marisol, the 19-year-old, had progressed more slowly but more steadily, and her case was the one that Dr. Cho said would anchor the research paper because her congenital condition represented a patient population that no existing mobility technology had successfully addressed. The 5th participant, the 61-year-old man named Warren, had not achieved ambulation. His injury involved nerve damage that extended beyond the spinal cord in ways that created signal interference the current algorithm couldn't fully compensate for. Mason had spent 3 weeks on Warren's case specifically, running the session data through every modification he could design, and the progress had been real. Warren could stand, could shift weight, could manage 2 or 3 assisted steps. But it was not the outcome the other 4 had reached, and Mason had sat with that for a while. Sat with it the way you sit with the fact that some problems are not yet solved, which is different from being unsolvable, and that the difference between those 2 things is the entire argument for continuing. He had told Warren this directly at the final session. Warren had looked at him with the dry patience of a man who had spent 2 years being told things directly and had developed a preference for it. So you're saying you're not done, Warren had said. I'm saying I'm not done with this specific problem, Mason said. No, Warren had nodded. All right, keep me posted. That was December. Mason drove home from the findings presentation with the heat on in the Jeep and the radio off, thinking about Warren and about Marisol and about Carter's laugh in the observation room, the short, disbelieving sound that was actually something else entirely. He drove across the bridge with the city lights laid out below and thought about the nature of problems, the difference between a problem you've solved and a problem you've reduced, and how most of the important problems in any field are in the second category for a long time before they move into the first. He pulled into the garage at 6:45. Lily was at the kitchen table with her homework, which had recently become significantly more complicated because she had tested into an accelerated math track that she had told Mason about with the careful understatement of someone who is very pleased and has decided that expressing it too directly would be undignified. How was it? she said, without looking up from the homework. Good, Mason said. 4 out of 5. Lily looked up at that. She understood, in the general terms that Mason had explained to her, what the trial was and what 4 out of 5 meant. Warren? She said. Still working on it. She nodded and went back to her homework. Mason made dinner. Pasta, because it was Thursday, and Thursday was pasta, a routine established sometime in the past year that neither of them had formally decided on, but both of them upheld. And they ate at the kitchen table with the homework pushed to one side and talked about Lily's math track and a project she was designing in her head about structural load distribution that her teacher had encouraged her to develop for the school science fair. And outside, the December dark pressed against the windows, and the garage below them sat quiet, the machine on its rack in the back room, patient as it had always been. After dinner, Lily said, "Is Sophia coming for Christmas?" Mason looked at his daughter. "I don't know. Why?" "Because I want to give her something," Lily said. "I made something." "You made something for Sophia." "Don't make it weird," Lily said, with the particular weary dignity of an 8-year-old who has decided that adults are frequently tiresome. "She helped me with the load distribution calculations. It's a thank you gift. It's not complicated." Mason looked at his daughter for a moment. "What did you make?" Lily produced from her backpack a small frame drawing, architectural in quality, precise lines, clearly done with the kind of focused effort she brought to things she cared about. It was a schematic of the machine, rendered in pencil on graph paper, with every component labeled in Lily's careful print. It was, Mason realized after a moment, more accurate than anything he'd ever drawn himself. Because Lily had been watching and learning for a year and had the visual memory of someone who pays attention to things she finds important. In the corner of the drawing, she had written, "For Sophia." This is the thing that changed everything. L. Mason looked at the drawing for a long time. "It's good, Lily," he said. "I know," she said. "Can you ask her if she's coming?" He texted Sophia that night. "Lily made you something. She wants to know if you're coming for Christmas." The response came 20 minutes later. "I wouldn't miss it." Wow. Christmas that year was small and imperfect and exactly right. Sophia came on Christmas Eve, which was a Saturday, arriving at noon with her driver, who had by now become a familiar fixture on the block, a quiet man named Bernard, who had once, memorably, helped Mason move a transmission housing without being asked and had declined payment with the air of someone for whom that kind of thing was simply what you did. She brought food, an absurd amount of food, the kind of abundance that people who grew up with money sometimes deploy as a form of love. And Mason had stopped being uncomfortable about this sometime in October, because the discomfort required more energy than simply being grateful for a good meal. Lily gave her the drawing before they'd even taken their coats off. Sophia looked at it for a long time, longer than a polite look, longer than a considered look, the kind of looking that means something is reaching somewhere real. Then she looked at Lily and said, "Did you label all the components from memory?" "I checked a few against the manual," Lily said. "The actuator joint nomenclature. I wasn't sure about the abbreviations." "These are right," Sophia said. She looked at the drawing again, at the thing that changed everything. "Can I keep this in my office?" "That's why I made it," Lily said. "So you'd remember where it came from." Sophia looked at Mason over Lily's head. He met her eyes and looked away, because the look was too full of something to meet straight on in front of his daughter on Christmas Eve. They ate in the kitchen, which was too small for 3 people and a table of food and was therefore perfect. They ate, and Lily talked about the science fair project, about a book she was reading about aerospace engineering history, about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate that she laid out with the precision of a legal argument and the passion of an 8-year-old who knows she was right, which Mason refrained from adjudicating because he had learned to pick those moments. Sophia listened and asked questions and argued one point of Lily's position back to her, not because she disagreed, but because she wanted to see if Lily could defend it. And Lily did. And Sophia said, "Good. Never give ground without knowing exactly what you're giving up." And Lily wrote this down in the small notebook she had recently begun carrying, which Mason found both alarming and entirely predictable. After dinner, Lily went to bed with the particular lack of resistance that Christmas Eve produces in children who have decided that sleep is the fastest route to morning. Mason and Sophia sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the meal and the particular ease of two people who have stopped performing ease and arrived at the actual version. The research paper is going to journal peer review in January, Sophia said. Dr. Cho thinks it'll be accepted. The findings are strong enough. What journal? She's submitting to Nature Biomedical Engineering first. If they pass, she'll go to Science Translational Medicine. Sophia turned her coffee cup in her hands. There's going to be attention when it's published. Media coverage, probably. The kind of story that, she paused, that journalists like. The Brooklyn mechanic, the paralyzed CEO. Mason looked at his coffee. I know, he said. Are you ready for it? He thought about this honestly. No, he said, but I'll manage. We'll manage, she said, with the slight correction of someone for whom the distinction matters. I've done media before. I know how to control a narrative. Hargrove's going to use it, Mason said. He had thought about this. Whatever shape the story takes, he'll find an angle. Let him, Sophia said. He'll be arguing against four people who can walk. That's a losing position and he knows it. He'll make noise and then he'll recalibrate. She paused. He's already recalibrating. Patricia told me last week. He's been quiet since the vote. Quiet for Hargrove means he's building something new. But the board dynamics have shifted. He needed Kimura and he lost Kimura, and Kimura's not going back. You sound certain. I am certain. Kimura saw the footage. Some things you can't unsee. She looked at the window, at the dark December outside. That video did more for the company's position than 6 months of earnings reports. Because numbers can be argued with. What he saw couldn't. They sat for a while in the quiet. Downstairs, the garage held its night silence. Upstairs, Lily was probably still awake, staring at the crescent moon nightlight with the barely contained anticipation of Christmas morning. The building breathed around them, old and imperfect and familiar. I've been thinking about the foundation, Sophia said. This was not new. They had talked in general terms, over the fall, about the long-term structure of the project. What was new was the word foundation, which she had not used before. Tell me, Mason said. Not a company, she said. Or not only. A research foundation, structured separately from Langford Technologies, with its own board and its own mandate. The mission is access, not developing the technology for the commercial market, which will happen and should happen, but ensuring that the people who need it most aren't priced out of it. She looked at him. The commercial licensing revenue funds the foundation. The foundation subsidizes access for people who can't afford the commercial system. Mason was quiet. I know it's more complicated than the garage, she said. Everything is more complicated than the garage, he said. That's not a reason not to do it. My father wants to be involved. He has opinions about the board structure. Of course he does, Mason said. And then, because it was true, he'd be good at it. The board structure. Sophia looked at him. This was one of the things she did. Looked at him directly when he said something she hadn't expected, as though she needed to verify it with her eyes. You've changed your mind about him, she said. I didn't have a mind about him. I had a read on him. The read changed when I saw more data. That's the most engineer answer possible. You keep calling me an engineer. You keep being one. She set down her coffee. The foundation. I want you to be part of the governance, not as an inventor who contributes technology, as a decision maker about mission and access. Because you're the only person in any of these rooms who built this for the reason it should be built. Mason looked at the table. The weight of this, not the complexity, the weight, the specific gravity of being asked to carry something important. I'm a mechanic from Brooklyn, he said. Mason. Her voice was even and direct and patient in the way it got when she was about to say something she had thought about carefully. I have a computer science degree from MIT and a biomedical engineering graduate degree, and I built a company from scratch, and I sat in a wheelchair for 2 years being told what my future looked like by people with better credentials than you. You know what I learned? He waited. Credentials tell you what someone has already done, she said. They don't tell you what someone is. You are the person who looked at a problem everyone else had decided required a billion-dollar lab to solve and built the answer on a workbench because the reason was good enough to figure out the rest. She paused. That's not a credential. That's a character. And I will take character over credential every time. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere on the block, someone was playing music. Faint, through walls and winter windows, something slow and warm. Okay, Mason said. Okay? Okay, he said again. I'll be part of it. Sophia nodded. She picked up her coffee. They sat for a while longer, and neither of them made the moment into anything more than it was, and it was already more than enough. The paper was published in March. The coverage came the way Sophia had said it would, fast and wide, the kind of story that spreads because it has an architecture that people understand. The impossible dream, the unlikely builder, the person who had been told no. The Brooklyn mechanic and the paralyzed CEO, and the machine assembled from salvaged parts and stubbornness that the billion-dollar labs hadn't managed to build because they were solving the wrong version of the problem. Mason did 3 interviews in the first week, which was 2 more than he was comfortable with, and he was honest in all of them in the particular way that people who don't perform honesty are honest. Directly, without polish, occasionally saying things that his publicist, whom Sophia had insisted he hire, winced at. He said that the algorithm was elegant, but the form factor was still a work in progress. He said that Warren's case was unresolved and that he was still working on it. He said, in the first interview, when asked how it felt to have built something that was changing lives, that he didn't know yet, because it had only been changing lives for a few months, and he was still more focused on the cases where it wasn't fully working than the cases where it was, which seemed like the right orientation to him. The interviewer had looked at him with the expression of someone who had prepared for a different kind of answer. Carter, the veteran, did an interview of his own that ran in a veterans magazine and then got picked up nationally. He talked about the trial and the machine and Mason in terms that Mason found almost unbearable to read, not because they were inaccurate, but because they were generous in a way that required him to accept the generosity rather than deflect it, which was an ongoing project. Marisol gave a talk at her design school about the intersection of engineering and lived experience, using her own case as the frame, and someone recorded it and it went wide online, and for 2 weeks strangers sent Mason messages through the garage's contact form, saying things that he read once and then didn't know what to do with. Lily helped him draft responses, which was both efficient and slightly humbling. Hargrove made noise, as Sophia had predicted. He gave a quote to a financial publication suggesting that the Langford Technologies CEO's personal involvement in an unvetted medical technology startup represented a conflict of interest, and Patricia issued a response through the company's communications team that was so precise and well-documented that the publication ran a correction. Hargrove went quiet after that. Not gone? People like Hargrove don't go. But quiet. And quiet was workable. Quote. The foundation was established in April. It was named the Claire Reed Mobility Foundation, which had been Sophia's suggestion, offered one evening in the kitchen upstairs with the same directness she brought to everything, and which Mason had not been able to respond to immediately because the name, hearing it said aloud in that context, reached somewhere that required a moment to reach back from. You don't have to, Sophia had said, reading his silence. I want to, he had said. I just needed a second. Take the second. He had. And then he had said yes, and the name had been filed with the appropriate legal documents. And in April, when the Foundation's website went live, there was a photograph of Claire on the About page. The ocean photograph from above the workbench, the laugh, the light, with a brief paragraph that Mason had written himself and revised 4 times before deciding that the 4th version was honest enough and the 5th would be overwrought. The Foundation's first grant cycle funded access to the commercial system for 11 people who couldn't afford it. The commercial licensing agreements, structured by a firm that Gerald had recommended and that Mason had read every page of before signing, generated the first significant revenue in the first quarter. The Foundation and the commercial track were separate and talking to each other in the way that Sophia had designed, which was efficiently and with a clear understanding of what each side owed the other. Gerald Langford sat on the Foundation board as Mason had expected and was good at it, as Mason had also expected. He had, over the course of the year, become someone Mason could talk to directly, which had required adjustment on both their parts. Gerald, because he had needed to revise his picture of the world, and Mason because he had needed to accept that revision without holding the original picture against the man. Neither of them was finished with the adjustment, but both of them were working on it, which was the best that could be said for most things. At the Foundation's first board meeting, Gerald had looked across the table at Mason and said, without preamble, "I owe you an apology for the assumptions I came to your garage with." Mason had considered several responses. Then he had said, "You came because you were scared for your daughter. That's not something you need to apologize for." Gerald had looked at him for a moment. Then he had nodded, and they had moved on to the next agenda item, and neither of them had mentioned it again. And that was enough. Lily's science fair project won first place in the regional competition, which surprised no one who had seen it, and she had shaken the judge's hand and said, "Thank you. I'm going to MIT," with the certainty of an 8-year-old who has already decided, and the judge had laughed, and Lily had not understood what was funny. Mason had framed the second-place ribbon from the previous year and put it on the garage wall, not because he forgot which one she'd won, but because he wanted to remember that she had tried the first time and lost and tried again, and that the trying again was the thing. Sophia had been at the science fair. She had sat next to Mason in the school gymnasium on a folding metal chair that was not designed for any adult's comfort, and they had watched Lily present her structural load distribution model with the focused intensity she brought to things that mattered. And Sophia had leaned over at one point and said quietly, "She's going to be formidable." "She already is," Mason said. "She gets it from you." He had looked at Sophia, and she had been looking at Lily on the presentation stage, and her profile in the gymnasium light was serious and warm and entirely itself, and Mason had thought, not for the first time, not even the 20th time, about what it meant to have someone in your life who had arrived through a broken-down Mercedes and 3 years of work and stubbornness and grief and the particular alchemy of two people solving a problem together until the problem was no longer the only thing between them. He had not said any of that. He was not a person who said things like that at science fairs. But later, walking to the cars in the school parking lot, with Lily walking ahead of them talking about a modification she wanted to make to the model, Sophia had moved her chair up alongside him and said, without looking at him, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," he said. "I've been thinking," she said, careful and direct in the way she was always careful and direct when it mattered, "that the garage is where everything started, and that I don't want to only come to the garage when there's a session. I'd like to come when there isn't one." The parking lot was cold, March being only nominally spring in Brooklyn. Lily was 10 feet ahead, examining a crack in the pavement with the interest of a child who finds structural failure genuinely fascinating. "You've been coming when there isn't one," Mason said. "On Saturday mornings," she said. "For coffee." "Right. That's not—" She stopped. Started again. "I'm saying this clumsily, which I don't usually do." A pause. "I'm saying that the thing that started as the machine has become other things. And I would like those other things to be what they are, rather than what I'm pretending they are for the sake of not being someone who admits what she wants." Mason looked at her. She was looking at the parking lot. "What do you want?" he said. She looked at him. The gymnasium light from the building behind them caught the side of her face, and she was exactly herself, controlled and real and slightly exasperated with her own precision, and she said, "You, specifically, in the specific terms that means. Which I think you already know, which is why I'm saying it now instead of continuing to not say it." Lily had stopped ahead of them and turned around, with the instinct of a child who knows something is happening. "Dad," she called, "are you guys coming?" "Yeah," Mason called back. He looked at Sophia. She was watching him with the expression she had when she was waiting for data, patient and not entirely. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." And, he said, "I've been not saying it too." She looked at him for a moment. Then something in her face shifted, opened, the way it did rarely and only when it was real. And she said, "Okay, good. That's settled then." "That's how you want to do this," he said. "That's settled then?" "I'm not going to be different than I am," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why." Lily had come back to where they were standing with the expression of someone who has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion. She looked at Sophia, and then at Mason, and then at Sophia again. Finally, she said, and walked back to the car. The thing about building something important, the thing Mason understood now, in a way he couldn't have articulated 3 years ago in the garage at midnight, is that you cannot fully see what you're building while you're building it. You can see the parts, you can see the problem you're solving. What you cannot see is the shape of the life that assembles around the work, because the work draws people to it, and the people become the thing that matters most. And that is not something you can engineer or plan or predict. He had built a machine to keep a promise to his sister. He had not known he was also building a way back for a woman who had been told her future was behind her. He had not known that the woman would walk into the back room of his garage and see the machine and say, "I want to try," and that trying together would become something neither of them had been looking for and both of them had needed. He had not known that his daughter, watching from the doorway and the workbench and the school gymnasium, would absorb everything she witnessed and build it into the person she was becoming. A person who understood that things worth doing require patience and failure and starting again, and that the people who show up for the hard version of something are the ones worth keeping. These are not things you can put in a patent application. They are not things that show up in a research paper or a foundation charter or a licensing agreement. They are the actual output of the work, and they arrive sideways, and you don't recognize them until they're already yours. On the first anniversary of the foundation, in April, there was an event, not a gala. Sophia had been emphatic about this, and Mason had been grateful because a gala was not something he had any idea how to navigate and would have managed badly. It was a gathering. Foundation space in a building in Midtown that Gerald had arranged. Trial participants, research staff, board members, a small group of journalists. Photographs on the walls. The machine in its first incarnation on the garage workbench. The second-generation system in the lab. Carter in the corridor at NYU Langone. Marisol at her design school talk. Warren standing for the first time, which was still not walking, but was not nothing, had never been nothing. And in the center of the room, a single display case. Inside it, the first-generation prototype, the original machine, the salvaged aluminum and the servo motors and the polymer tubing and the control board that a 22-year-old had sold him for $40. Dr. Cho had suggested retiring it to the Foundation's permanent collection. Mason had agreed and then spent a week being slightly unsettled by the idea of the machine in a display case, and then had decided that retired was the right word. It had done its work. It deserved to rest. He stood in front of the case for a while before the event started. The room was filling up behind him. He could hear voices, the particular sound of people who are gathering for something they consider meaningful and are not quite sure how to carry it. He looked at the machine, at the wiring he had run and rerun, at the foam padding Sophia had criticized and then helped redesign, at the control board with the handwriting on one corner, a notation he'd made in the first month of the third year, coordinates for the sensor position that had taken him 2 months to find. He thought about Claire, not the tiredness, not the apartment in March, and the woman jogging past the window. He thought about her laughing. The ocean photograph. The full, loud, consuming laugh she'd had. The one that took over her whole face that she'd never been careful about, never performed. He thought about what she would have said standing in this room, looking at the display case. She would have said something caustic and loving in equal measure. She would have found the most absurd detail in the room and named it loudly. She would have embarrassed him and then hugged him in the way she had that was less tender than fierce, the way that sisters who have been through things hug. He missed her with a sharpness that surprised him, because grief has the habit of arriving sharpest at the moments of completion, when the thing you were carrying was partly the weight of the grief itself, and now the weight has become something else, and you feel the shape of what was there. Sophia came to stand next to him. She had walked from the door to the display case, not the length of a workspace, not 31 steps, not 63, but across a room of people and a polished floor on the second-generation system, which she wore beneath tailored clothing and which was visible only in the slight mechanical quality of her gait that she had long since stopped being self-conscious about. She looked at the machine in the case. "How are you doing?" she said. "Okay," he said. "Missing Claire. Tell me something about her that I don't know," he thought. "She was a terrible cook," he said. "She thought she was good. She was genuinely, confidently terrible. Every family dinner she would offer to bring something, and everyone would say, "No, no, just bring yourself," and she took it as a compliment. Sophia laughed. The real one, the surprised one that he had, over the course of a year, stopped bracing for and started simply waiting for, because it arrived when it arrived, and it was always worth it. She sounds like someone I would have fought with constantly, Sophia said. She would have loved that, Mason said. She loved a fight with someone who could keep up. They stood together in front of the display case while the room filled around them. Mason, Sophia said. Yeah. Look at the room. He looked. Carter, near the bar, talking to Marisol's mother with the ease of someone who has found that the experience of being changed by something is its own form of common language. Marisol herself, tablet in hand, sketching something. She had told Mason 3 weeks ago that she was designing a prosthetics lab for her senior thesis, incorporating the machine's aesthetic principles, the functional design that doesn't sacrifice form because form is part of what gives people back their dignity. Dr. Cho and Torres in a corner, deep in what was clearly a technical argument, Torres gesturing at something only he could see. Gerald, across the room, talking to a couple Mason didn't recognize. Future donors, probably, or journalists. Gerald moving through the room with the purpose of a man who has decided what his contribution to this is and is delivering it without being asked. Lily, standing near the photographs, looking at the picture of the first-generation machine on the garage workbench. She had a notebook out and was writing something. She looked up, caught her father's eye across the room, and held up what she'd written. He was too far to read it. He crossed the room to her and she held the notebook up again. She had written, "This is where it started. Make sure they know that." He looked at his daughter, 8 years old and already understanding that the story matters as much as the result. That people need to know where things come from, because the origin tells you whether you can believe the destination. "I'll make sure," he said. She clicked her pen and went back to her notes, satisfied. He went back to Sophia. She had watched the exchange from across the room with the expression she had when she was storing something. "What did she write?" Sophia said. He told her. Sophia looked at the display case, at the machine inside it, at the garage workbench and the photograph on the wall, the moving blanket curtain, the space heater's cord in the corner of the frame, the granola bar wrapper he'd forgotten to clean up before taking the picture. All of it. "She's right," Sophia said. "She usually is," Mason said. "It's inconvenient." The event director came to tell them it was time to start, and Sophia moved toward the front of the room and Mason followed, and the room settled into the particular attention of people who have gathered to acknowledge that something real has happened and are not quite sure whether language is going to be adequate to the task. Sophia spoke first. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, the public version of herself assembled with precision and intelligence. But what was different now was that the public version and the private version were less far apart than they had been. She talked about the trial results and the Foundation's first year and the next phase of research, and then she paused and looked at the display case, and she said, without the prepared quality of the rest of it, "I walked into a garage in Brooklyn because I had run out of every other idea. And I found a machine that someone had built for the right reason, which is the only reason anything important ever gets built. I want to be clear about what I mean by the right reason. Not money, not recognition, not the problem's technical elegance, though it is technically elegant. He built it because someone he loved couldn't walk, and he decided that was unacceptable." She stopped. "That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything else followed from that." She sat down. Mason stood up. He was not good at this, and he had not prepared beyond a few notes on the back of a parking receipt that he had decided, standing at the display case, not to use. He looked at the room, at Carter and Marisol and Warren in the front row, Warren, who still could not fully walk and whose case was still in Mason's notebook, as an open problem, at Lily with her notebook, at Sophia sitting with the straightness she always carried, and he said what was true. "My sister's name was Claire," he said. "She would have made this event much louder and considerably more embarrassing, and I think it would have been better for it." He waited for the small sound that moved through the room. "I built the machine for her, and then it turned out to be for more people than I knew. That is the thing I didn't understand when I started, and that I've spent the past year trying to understand. That what you build for one person, if the reason is real, becomes capable of reaching people you've never met. He looked at Warren. We're not finished. There are people the current system doesn't fully serve, and that is the work in front of us. And I will be honest with you that I don't know how long it will take or what it will require, but I know the reason is still good enough to figure out the rest. He sat down. Lily had written something in her notebook. She showed it to Sophia, who read it and smiled, the real one, and showed it to Mason after. The reason is still good enough. Write that down. He folded the paper receipt with his unused notes and put it in his jacket pocket and looked at the display case across the room, at the machine he had built in the dark after his daughter was asleep. And he thought about the things that are built in small rooms for private reasons that turn out to be the reasons that matter most. He thought about all the things he hadn't been able to plan. The connection that starts with a broken alternator and ends with a life you couldn't have designed. The daughter who watches everything and becomes sharper and more herself for the watching. The father across the room who revised his picture of the world and became someone different for it. The machine that started as a promise and became a foundation. The woman who had walked into the back of his garage in a wheelchair and walked out of a conference room on her own 2 feet, and who had sat next to him at a science fair on a folding metal chair and said, I've been thinking about something. He thought about Claire laughing, the ocean, the light. Some promises, once you've made them, become larger than you. They grow into things you didn't foresee and couldn't contain and wouldn't want to, because the growing is the point. It was always the point. You just couldn't see it from the inside of a garage at midnight, which is the only place where things like this can begin. The evening light came through the windows of the foundation space and fell across the display case and the photographs and the room full of people. And Mason Reed, mechanic from Brooklyn, engineer by practice, father by grace, sat in the warmth of what he had built and let it be as large as it had become. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, as his sister would have said loudly and without apology, exactly what was supposed to happen.